Ah, yes. I remember. We are men. We are the sons of Greece. We are scions of terror. And long have we seen our homeland suffer at the whims of the Persian dogs, by the hands of the traitor scum. They have sought to destroy us, but we will not yield. With the might of Macedon and the unity of Greece, with the iron of Mars and the faith of terror, the Achaemenids shall pay for their hubris. The heretics will suffer for their treachery. Our retribution is at hand. They think us cowed. They think us beaten. But we are unbowed. Ready yourselves now, my brothers. By spear and shield, by bolt and blade, we march to war! In the name of the god Zeus of Olympus, in the name of the god emperor of mankind, we shall conquer! Ah, yes. I remember now. Imagination and actuality, fantasy and reality, history and fiction. Often are these decried as opposites, as anathema to one another as order is to chaos. Yet, is not all fiction based on history, a retelling of a story, rather than a brand new one? In some cases, this is done subtly, as an homage or a warning to the past. In other cases, it is far more direct and verbose, such as the story of the Lord Solar Macharius, which is a retelling of the story of Alexander III, the Great, King of Macedon, Emperor of the Persian Empire, and Lord of all the known world. Yet, how closely do these two men parody each other? Are they two sides of the same coin? Do people miss the point of both their stories? And most damning of all, are they actually the same person? Salutations Rangers, I am General Bradley 101, and by the end of the story, we'll both have the answers, and most likely, even more questions. But first, who even are these men? Who was Alexander the Great? And who was Lord Solar Macharius? But before we can get started with today's video, I gotta say a massive thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. Manta Sleep is a company that has dedicated itself to helping people sleep better through its beautiful sleep masks. Now, I'm a little skeptical of sleep masks, I won't lie, but Manta reached out and they were like, hey, here we go, we'll send you something, tell us what you want, give it a look, if you like it, promote it, if you don't, no hard feelings. And considering that they've done some partnerships with some of my boys, everyone's had really good experiences with them, so I was like, yeah, sure. But when I tell you, I got this thing and it is the most premium, the most beautifully made, high quality, and most importantly of all, it works like a charm. Like, I'm someone who has trouble sleeping, right? But with this thing, it really does make a difference. And you may think that a sleep mask is intrusive, but it's really not. Like, I have had such a hard time even remembering that it's there until I actually feel the damn thing. I'm like, oh no, there's actually a sleep mask. You know, but I absolutely love this thing. I highly, highly recommend it. If you guys have trouble sleeping and you don't want to go on pills, grab yourself a sleep mask. It actually helps really a lot. So I want to say a massive thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. So if you want to pick up one of these awesome sleep masks that are not only super affordable, make sure to click the link down below and use the code GB101 to get a 10% discount on your next purchase. And make sure to use the link down below, because then Manta knows that your boy is doing in the work and I get a little bit of a dollar on that side. Yes, sir. But, ladies and gentlemen, highly recommend Manta. Thank you, Manta, once again. You guys have been absolutely amazing. Wait, wasn't I doing something? It is the year 356 of the 41st millennium, and the Imperial man is yet again recovering from a devastating civil war, this time spawned by the ambitions and lusts of one Goj Vantire. A little man with not only an evil-sounding name, but also an evil soul. Yet, in the aftermath of his death, at the hands of the newly formed Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, the Imperium is looking inward, except for one man. For on the civilized world of Donia, Governor Pella would receive an heir to not only his legacy, but to that of all humanity, as Macharius would be born. As I mentioned before, the similarities between him and Alexander are not subtle. Macharius would grow and prosper in his youth, receiving the best military and civilian education that the planet could offer him. And while he excelled in both, when it came to matters of warcraft, he was unmatched. As by the time he was 20, he was already a seasoned commander of men. Yet it would be his next actions that would set him on the path from general to legend. As upon the world of Roxanne, a rebellion would erupt, the rebels choosing this as their time to strike for the current Lord Solar, known as Philips. Though, at that point he should have just been called Philip, was present on the world. The rebels sought to capture the War Master of the Imperium and use him as a bargaining chip. Lord Solar being the new title for the position of War Master, as the previous holder of the title had caused some problems for the Imperium, and thus was Philips placed in mortal danger, his household guard overrun by the sheer volume of enemies they faced, and it seemed that the Lord Solar would face the catastrophic ignominy of being a prisoner. Yet, at the 11th hour, a young general, so bold and daring, it was practically foolhardy and reckless, having seemingly materialized out of nowhere, descended upon the rebels like an angry god, and with one fell swoop, crushed the rebellion, and saved Philips in only one battle. Philips, seeing this young warrior, knew he was destined for greatness, and thus took him under his wing, imparting him with all the knowledge and experience he had. And Macharius proved to be such a prodigy of a student that Philips would name him as a successor to Lord Solar. And on his death, surprisingly not at the hands of assassins or imperial court intrigue, but during the battle for Lamont Landings, Macharius would be elevated to Lord Solar, and he would have grand ambitions for the future. Ambitions that would require brave men to act upon them, and those men Macharius had found, as over the course of his military career, he had found several kindred spirits, who also just so happened to be rather good military commanders. These were Sejanus, Borgen Crassus, Turken, Aryan, Lysander of Capoli, and Silas of Rallentine. With his ascension to Lord Solar, Macharius was granted full and total command of the military forces of the Segmentum Solar, one of the 5 main provinces of the Imperium. He was also in overall command of the entire armed forces of the Imperium. In addition to this, the rank also came with the additional title of High Lord of Terror. The High Lords were the ruling council that governed the Imperium on the Emperor's behalf, in theory at least. Though Macharius would not spend his time overseeing the times of the Imperium, nor would he engage in the Byzantine court intrigues that permeated terror. He was the Lord Solar. He was a man of war, and to war he would go. His first campaign was to secure his home region and establish a power base that he could use as a base of forward operations for his future plans. While the Imperium's borders were stable, Macharius needed a forward staging ground that would allow him to strike deep into the foe. To that end, the worlds of Land's End, Morbellum, and Jarfese III were seized in quick succession, with minor losses and material expended. Part of this was due to Macharius being an excellent commander, but it cannot be understated that his troops were of the highest quality. While he had the full might of the Segmentum Solar armed forces at his command, for this campaign, he used his own Dornian army of Astra Militarum regiments, drawn from his homeworld. These units were not only loyal to Macharius, but were also well trained, disciplined, and seasoned, as they had served under Macharius prior. These were primarily heavy infantry regiments, screened by lighter troops and supported by fast-moving heavy armor. We have no art of these lads, but I'd imagine carapace armor with Phrygian helms, but we'll learn more about these chaps later on in our story. But the combination of brilliant officers, impeccable troops, and unlimited resources backed by a robust supply chain meant that Macharius blitzed through these worlds as if they were nothing. Macharius saw this, as did his ambition. With his forward base established, Macharius had what he needed. He expressed to his fellow officers, his men, the High Lords of Terror, and the Imperium as a whole, his intent was not merely a few worlds, but all of the galaxy. To that end, he would launch a crusade to reconquer the stars. This would be a great crusade to restore the glory of humanity The Lord Solar would gather a force comprising of chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, Tagmata of the Machine God, cohorts of Titans, households of Knights, holy orders of the Ecclesiarchy, and many more. But these forces were minorities, far outnumbered by the rest of the army. For to the credit of the Imperium of Man and the vast human spirit, the total majority of his force was made up of regiments of the Astra Militarum, the mortal men and women of the Imperial Guard, and the fleets of the Armada Imperialis, the mighty warships of the Imperial Navy. And upon the shrine world of Macaria, in the Segmentum Pacificus, Lord Solar Macharius would rally his men, and with his army arrayed for war, marshaled into 7 different army groups, each one of them led by one of Macarius' companions, with the first being led by Macarius himself. And the first army group, with Macarius at his head, would be the first to board the orbital transports, and with that single step, the greatest triumph of military might mankind had known since the days of the Great Crusade itself was now in motion. For the Macarian Crusade had just begun. The first target of the crusade was the system of Karsk. During the Age of Apostasy, the Imperium was forced to abandon the system, leaving its inhabitants to their own devices. In the wake of Imperial absence, a hyper-radical religious cult known as the Angels of Fire had sprung forth and taken control over the system, ruling in the name of their Angel of Fire. Macarius and his forces blitzed through the system, the religious fanatics no match for the forces of the Lord Solar. The final battle of the system came when the capital of the system, Karsk Prime, was assaulted by the Imperials, with Macarius himself leading the charge, as he often did. But as always, his bravery and dedication would cost him, as he would be wounded during the initial assault. As the Imperials assaulted the capital city, the cultists were all but finished. Yet that is when a rift in the very fabric of reality opened up, and out of their blasphemous shrines strode forth the Angel of Fire. As it turns out, that the cultists were agents of chaos, whether willing or unwilling, as the Angel of Fire, a Lord of Change, a greater demon of the Chaos God Tzeentch, Lord of Magic and Trickery, stepped forward. As the colossal beast stood before the Lord Solar, he offered him an accord. Swear fealty to the God of Change, and arise a mighty demon prince. Macarius, still wounded, facing a monster of nightmares, spat in the face of this beast. He was a devoted servant of the Imperium, and he only served one god, and that was the God Emperor of mankind. His faith manifesting itself in golden light, Macarius charged the shock demon, and as the two dueled, the faith of the Lord Solar Macharius would be far stronger than the magic of the Lord of Change. As Macarius, Lord Solar of the Imperium of Man, full of great might and righteous wrath, was so terrible that the demon lord could not withstand it, for his dark magics failed him, and he was proven lesser than his foe. And thus did Macarius, the Lord Solar, invoking the name of the God Emperor of mankind, strike down this foul creature, and cast his ruin back from whence it came. And as their champion was sent back to the hell screaming from which it had cometh, the followers of the demon lost heart, and were destroyed utterly. For the dark fire of this unholy angel had been brought low by the light of the Lord Solar Macharius. And thus did the Lord Solar go on. Sadly, we don't have a detailed account of the battles fought during the 7-year campaign, but we do know the most notable events, such as in 392, where the high world of Persepolis will be reconnected with the wider Imperium. It is uncertain, but considering we have no mention of any conflict on the world, it is believed that the system was brought back into the Imperial fold without any blood being spilled. As throughout the Crusade, many worlds will be brought back into the arms of the Emperor, via the tools of oratory rather than war. In the same year, Macarius' first army group and General Sejanus' second army group would fight together on the vast desert world of Gendrosia. And upon this world, Macarius would find the tomb of the ancient Imperial explorer, Injona the Vagrant. I wasn't kidding when I said the references were heavy-handed. But from this adventure, Macarius would take his golden winged relic helm as his own, which would become a symbol of not only Macarius, but the Crusade as a whole. In the year 393, the Crusade would be tested as they would assault the world of Zarga IV. Over the past millennia, the world had become a stronghold for various Chaos Space Marine warbands. The fighting was vicious and brutal, no side giving or offering any quarter. Despite the danger, which was increased due to nature of both the fighting and the foe who fought it, Macarius still took to the field. As always, he led his men from the front. During a battle for the world, he was struck square in the chest with a bolt shell, yet while the round embedded itself in his breastplate, it did not go off. This was a brilliant stroke of luck. Or was it? For the members of the ecclesiarchy who saw it, this was nothing less than the divine intervention of the God Emperor of mankind, who had saved his favorite son in a dire moment. This was a sign of the Emperor's blessing for Macharius, and thus it was a miracle. And after its liberation, the world of Zaga 4 would become an ecclesiarchy world, where many would pilgrimage to see the sight of such a blessed miracle. In the year 395, the most important battle would be fought of that year, that of Thoth. The brutal fortress world would take its toll on General Arian's 6th Army Group, but undaunted, they were able to conquer most of the world, with only one citadel left in the enemy's hands. Arian was unable to press the attack, however. His strength was spent, and his men needed to rest. It was at this crucial moment that Macharius and his 1st Army Group would descend to the planet as reinforcements, with Macharius attacking the citadel from the front, thus distracting them. Arian's forces were able to outflank the citadel and breach its walls, allowing for Thoth to be completely liberated. Yet, the fighting for Thoth was a nightmare. The siege of Andrates V was pure hell unleashed. In that same year, General Crassus and his 5th Army Group would begin the siege. The world of Andrastes V was unlike anything the Imperials had seen. Apparently untouched since the heresy, the independent human civilization which controlled Andrastes was so highly advanced and wielded such devastating weaponry that the Imperials were held at the world for nearly 2 years, with General Crassus' 5th Army suffering over 90% casualties. This was owed to no fault of the general himself, who was an exemplary battlefield commander, but the difference in power was just too sheer to overcome. In the end, the Imperials lost the siege. Crassus' force was beyond combat ineffective, yet Macharius would refuse to let them lose the battle. In retribution for the dear lives of his men, Macharius would order a comet thrown at the world, destroying most of the planet and its population, but forcing the remaining defenders to surrender unconditionally to the Lord Solar. The final great act of the Macharian Crusades would come in the year 397, as Macharius would face off against a massive orc war. This would be the bloodiest battle of the Crusades, with Macharius personally facing the war's war boss atop his massive Squigoth. The entire 7-year campaign was held upon a knife's edge, all waiting to see what would happen. But thankfully for the Imperials, Macharius would triumph and destroy the war, sending the remnants into the darkness beyond the Astronomicon. With this final blow, he and his men had done the unthinkable, the impossible. They had conquered all of known space, for they had reached the very end of the light that was given to them by the holy Astronomicon. Beyond this point, there was no certainty. Nothing was known. Only tall tales of ancient horrors, foul Xenos, and the howls of desperate spirits. Yet to Macharius, this did not matter. What mattered to him was that there was still space within this galaxy which did not fly the banner of the Imperium, and did not serve the God Emperor of mankind. And this was a sin he could not allow, for he would march forward past this river of darkness, banish any horrors, slay any alien, and denounce any spirit that would get in his way, for that was the Emperor's will, and he conquered the whole galaxy if the Emperor willed it, and thus he was determined to move forward. His army, however, was of a different mind. By 399, the Crusade had reached the very end of known Imperial space, for they found themselves deep within the Halo stars. Countless worlds lay behind him, each one reincorporated into the Imperium of the Emperor of mankind. For after Macharius had conquered them, waves of ecclesiarchy preachers came to preach the true word of the God Emperor. Adepts and administrators of the Adeptus Ministratus and imperial bureaucracy came to conduct censuses and measure tithes, and the relentless agents of the Inquisition scoured the worlds to find any taint of the terrible alien, the foul heretic, and the damned mutant. And they would cleanse them wholly and utterly with the forgiving flame of the most holy ordo of the God Emperor's Inquisition. Yet the Lord Solar did not bother with administration or governance of these new realms. He left that to the men sent from Terra, for Macharius was prepared to leap into the darkness of the unknown and claim it for the Emperor. His troops, however, would go no further, for they were scared of the blackness of the void. Who were they to tread where even the light of the Emperor would not go, where even the demigods of Primarchs did not go? No, they would go no further. Their bravery had reached its end. Or so, that is how it is told by Imperial scholars and ecclesiarchy priests. Yet this was only partly true. The real reason why his men refused to fight was because they were just tired. After 7 long and hard years of bloody and terrible fighting, they, both body and spirit, of man, beast, and machine, were brought to their very limit. Many of the men who had marched upon those orbital transports 7 years ago never set foot back upon them, instead finding their final resting places on countless forsaken worlds. It was not only morale and fear that stayed the mighty Imperial juggernaut, but also sense, as his fleet would be greatly slowed in that foul region, as without the guiding light of the Astronomicon, his navigators would be nearly unable to translate via the warp with any modicum of safety, and his astropaths would be far beyond the range of psychic communication to Imperial space, meaning that any communication had to be delivered via courier ship. And as we have established, warp travel was unsafe at best, and at worst, well, we don't really know. And that is the scary part, as several of the scout teams that had been sent out into the darkness never returned, with those who did often returning mauled and bearing tales of mighty enemies and even fouler creatures still, for rumor abounded that a strange phenomena affected the rest of the Halo stars, that the dead did not rest, but rather they roamed the stars and the worlds of the Halo stars, haunting both the living and the dead. Faced with all these factors, both Macharius' men and his officers were against moving forward. Indeed, it appeared that the only one who wished to press further was the Lord Solar himself, a fact which he was not pleased with. It is said that when Macharius was told of the wishes of the army, he went out to speak with his men, to rally them once again as he had done countless times in the past. Yet his words could not move his men this time, and when this became clear, Macharius was said to fly into a great rage, angered by the weakness of man, weakness which he seemingly did not possess. His soldiers were cowards, his commanders betrayers. Thus, where he couldn't find comfort in battle, he would find it in the bottle. Seemingly lost without battle, and deeply hurt by what he saw as the greatest betrayal since the heresy, he locked himself in his stateroom and drunk himself into near oblivion. Such was the sorrow that he drowned in liquor, that his physicians were worried that even his emperor-blessed constitution would give way. But Macharius, for some unknown reason, would recover his wits and order the army to return back to Imperial space, apparently finally accepting his transition from general to governor. But the Emperor had other plans for the Lord Solar, as in the year 400 M41, Macharius, who had still not recovered from his heartbreak, finally succumbed to a jungle fever he had contracted on the jungle world of Junja. Thus, if the mortal men of the Imperium would not stand with Macharius, then the Emperor of mankind gladly would. Yet while Macharius' army did not wish to fight the darkness anymore, that did not mean that they did not wish to serve their Lord Solar. Indeed, for upon learning of his passing, every man in the army would have gladly given their lives to see the mighty hero returned. Such was their grief, and so deep was their sorrow. Macharius' body was returned to his homeworld, and was renamed Macharia in the honor of the fallen Lord Solar. A massive state funeral was held there, and all within the Imperium would come and pay respects to this great hero. From the mighty High Lords of Terra, the revered cardinals of the Ecclesiarchy, the immortal Magi of the Adeptus Mechanicus, scions of rotated dynasties, to the demigods of the Adeptus Astartes, and many other important figures of the Imperium, all would come and bow low their heads in both awe and respect to one of the greatest leaders the Imperium and humanity had ever known. 1,000,000 troops, Macharius' Donian veterans at the front, led the funeral procession. As the procession made its way to the tomb, over 100 Astra Militarum generals would lay their swords upon the ornate sarcophagus of the Lord Solar, a final gift to their mighty lord. Shortly after his death, the Adeptus Ministorum officially recognized what many had known for countless years. Macharius was a living saint of the Emperor, and was canonized as such in the Imperial cult, becoming the patron saint for the entire Astra Militarum and human soldiery as a whole. Macharia was then transformed into a sacred shrine world dedicated to the former Lord Solar, and millions of pilgrims from across the Imperium would make the long journey every year to visit the grand Imperial Cathedral erected over his final resting place, to pay homage and gaze upon in awe and deep respect to this mighty soldier king of man. And while his legacy would be eternal, his conquests would not. His generals would then squabble amongst themselves, each one wanting to claim the title of Lord Solar, allies becoming enemies, friends becoming foes, and what was once united after so long became broken in such a short time, as his generals would murder, plot, and scheme against one another, until all that were left alive openly revolted against the Imperium, claiming their own petty kingdoms, for they would wage war against each other, undoing all that their great lord had tried to create. The Macharian Crusades quickly became the Macharian Heresy. Seeing this affront to the God Emperor, humanity, and the legacy of the Lord Solar, the High Lords of Terra arrayed a mighty force of Adeptus Astartes, led by a new chapter. Yet these warriors were clad in weapons far older and more terrible than any save for the first legions possessed, and clad in armor that matched the veterans of the old Crusades. Led by a mighty giant of a space marine said to be equal to that of a venerable Adeptus Custodes, the mighty life words of the Emperor himself. For these were the Minotaurs, and this would be the first time that the Imperium saw the shield bearers of the High Lords, and it would not be the last, for their bloody retribution would be called upon many more in the years to come. For the war waged by the Minotaurs was equal parts ruthless and devastating. All warlords would be slain, and anyone deemed a traitor was slain outright. It would be the Minotaurs who would lead the spearhead against the petty kingdom of the outlaw Colonel Lyrus from the 11th Kondaku Armored Corps, leader of the famed Kudassian Immortals. However, upon the icy plains of Gyros Prime, the land raiders of the chapter would shatter the Immortals, ruining them utterly. From there they would move to the high world of Duval and the sword realms of the Hope Cluster, where they would decree those worlds unrecoverable and sentence them to exterminatus, destroying them utterly. Upon the ocean world of Neris 4, a vital agri-world in the system, they would hunt down and obliterate the apparently Xenos-possessed remnants of the Imperial Paladins' 4th Company. However, to combat their Astartes in the subsurface cavern cities, the Minotaurs would deploy terrible weapons, vicious toxicrine munitions, which would then leave the once glorious seas completely poisoned and the agri-world ruined. Upon the Euxine system, the Minotaurs would find the chapters of the Doom Warriors and the Inceptors, formerly allies in the Macharian Crusade. They were engaged in an honor duel, combating between the two chapters with agreed-upon rules and times. When the Imperials tried to negotiate the matter, the Doom Warriors and the Inceptors would not leave until the matter was resolved. The Minotaurs would then be asked to go in and resolve the dispute and end the strife. The Minotaurs, neither contacting either chapters, assaulted them unexpectedly and furiously. The Doom Warriors would evacuate the system in poor order. However, for the Inceptors, they were left stranded, as the Minotaurs had purposely targeted their transports, leaving the venerable chapter upon the planet, with nowhere else to turn to. The Inceptors were a vaunted second founding chapter, descended from the Ultramarines. They had served the Imperium loyally and faithfully over the years. Yet the Minotaurs did not care for any of this. With the loss of their warships, the Inceptors were ruthlessly and systematically encircled and destroyed from orbit, as the once proud chapter was rent asunder and laid far lower than they ever should have fallen. To add a more grievous insult to this blasphemous act, the Minotaurs were stripped dead of all their relics, these being the same relics that the chapter had possessed during the days of the legions. They would then cannibalize their vaunted vehicles, and would even take the chapter's flagship, a Great Crusade-era assault transport, as a spoil of war. Such a terrible act of desecration was not taken lightly by the Scions of Guilliman, with the Minotaurs being barred from ever entering Ultramar on pain of death, and many of Guilliman's sons have sworn vengeance on the Minotaurs for this most heinous act. Ironically, it would be Guilliman himself who would render this long overdue judgment on the Minotaurs, as they, together with the High Lords of Terra, would stand against the returned sun, with the first consul of Ultramar laying them low, nearly destroying them, before reconstituting them, ensuring that the semi-new chapter would hold no loyalties to the High Lords. In summary, under the command of the new Imperial War Master Solon, appointed by the High Lords of Terra, with elements of over 100 Space Marine chapters participating in the retribution, which became known as the suppression of the Macharian heresy, the Imperium would reclaim many worlds Macharius had conquered, restoring them to the rule of the God Emperor, and removing any stain from the legacy of the great Lord Solar Macharius. Or so, that is how the story is told. For while the records of the Macharian Crusades are true when it comes to the battles and campaigns, or as true as we can hope them to be, when we get to the history after the Crusades, that is when things get a little chaotic. For upon the world of Loki, one of Macharius' generals, Richter, had already betrayed the Lord Solar, having secretly fallen to the foul whispers of the Plague Father, the god of disease and death, whom had seduced the once great general with untold power, and thus did Richter try and assassinate the Lord Solar by poisoning him, claiming the new empire for the Plague God. Yet Macharius would survive the attack, but not unscathed. He would then lead his mighty armies and destroy Richter and all those loyal to him. After a long stalemate, he would see the Imperials victorious, with Macharius personally slaying the would-be demon prince in single combat. Yet while this victory stopped the aspiration of chaos, all was not right with the Lord Solar. For while he had not died from the blessings of Nurgle, that did not mean that he would not die from them. For it would seem that the Lord Solar will meet his end not by righteous battle and vaunted reverence, but by being taken by the foulness of the archenemy. Yet seemingly the archenemy would have the final say, as Macharius would be slain by a chaos cultist in the disguise of an inquisitorial stormtrooper of the retinue of Inquisitor Drake. But this too is not the whole truth. It is rumored that Inquisitor Drake had fed strategic and tactical information to the rogue General Richter, which is what led to the stalemate on Loki. Yet this may just be a cover-up for what many believe to be the final, real truth. That the High Lords of Terra could not allow a legend like Macharius to fall to the insidious gifts of the Chaos Gods. And even darker still, that they could not allow Macharius to gain any more fame and power, for they could allow none to eclipse them as the rulers of the Imperium. Thus, according to the testimony of a forgotten lone survivor, after Richter's death, it was an Officio Assassinorum agent, not a Chaos cultist, that had masqueraded as the Imperial Stormtrooper that killed Macharius. The agent would then proceed to kill Inquisitor Drake as well, tying up any loose ends. Whether the High Lords also had a hand in the fracture of Macharius' conquests, or whether we just have good old-fashioned human greed and hubris to blame for that, we will never know. But what we do know is that those who gained the most from the Macharian Crusade were the High Lords, as it was their Minotaurs that saved the great venture. If you consider utter reckless destruction and pointless thievery as being saved, well, then you may want to see a therapist. And while many worlds would be reincorporated into the Imperium, many worlds would be utterly destroyed, or retain their independence, whether being so on the edge of the conquest that the Imperium didn't bother with them, or having been reconquered by the Astartes but the garrison properly, if at all, and would eventually return to self-governance, if in all but name. Ultimately, the result would be a positive one for the Imperium. Or would it? For while the Imperium had more worlds than they started with, many had died to take them, and how many more had died to claim them, and then reclaim them after? Could the floundering Imperium, overburdened by power-hungry madmen at its helm, even maintain these new worlds? Could they even maintain their current ones? In fact, had this actually been a blow to the dying Imperium? Were those who ruled it so greedy and jealous that they slayed their greatest champion since the Emperor himself? And if that was so, those same men now had even more power to wield as they saw fit. In addition to all this, they had a Space Marine chapter which they called their own. Was this not a breach of every law and oath that represented the Astartes? Were they even the Emperor's angels? For yes, they rendered death, but it was death to fellow humans. Those whose only crime they had committed was to be born upon a world which they did not control, nor had any say in. And what of the Lord Solar himself? What was he? A gilded figure, brought low by weak and evil men around him? A drunken warmongerer, cosplaying as a wicked tyrant? Or was he just a man, flawed as you and I? Questions, countless questions, yet no answers. At least, not here. No, to truly understand this warrior king, we must look at this from a different angle. But I get ahead of myself. That, like all good things, will come in due time. But for now, I've told you how Macharius conquered the galaxy. But who were these mighty men that allowed him to do so? The armies of the Macharian conquest were collectively known as the Macharian Crusade, At the head of the crusade was the Lord Solar Macharius himself. The crusade was then divided into 7 different army groups, each one led by a general of Macharius, with the first being led by Macharius himself. The army groups were as such: the first army group, the Lord Solar's own, led by General Macharius himself, composed of Donial Imperial Guard regiments, multiple regiments of Byzant Janzars, multiple regiments of Cadian shock troopers, multiple regiments of Death Corps of Krieg, and multiple regiments of Mercian Fusiliers. We then have the second army group, Sejanus' Steel, led by General Sejanus, composed of multiple regiments of Barak Pioneers, multiple regiments of Cadian shock troopers, and regiments of the Mauryan Iron Guard, specifically the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 12th, and 14th regiments respectively. We then have the third army group, the Backbreakers, led by General Tarka, composed of multiple regiments of the Cadian shock troopers, multiple regiments of the Elysian drop troopers, and multiple regiments of the Genswick rifles. We then have the fourth army group, the Mirage, led by General Lysander, composed of multiple regiments of the Armageddon Steel Legion, multiple regiments of the Canuck Skulltakers, multiple regiments of the Talon Desert Raiders. It is not confirmed, but it is believed that the 11th Armored Kandaku Corps, where the venerable Kandasian immortals of the infamous Colonel Lyris hail from, were a part of this army, but this is pure speculation, as nothing is confirmed. We then have the 5th army group, the Gauntlets of Crassus, led by Borgen Crassus, composed of multiple regiments of Cadian shock troopers, multiple regiments of Harkoni Warhawks, and multiple regiments of the Praetorian Guard. We then have the 6th army group, the Hard Luck 6th, led by General Arian, composed of regiments of the Katakan Jungle Fighters, specifically the 5th, 6th, 12th, and 14th regiments respectively, multiple regiments of Malkor Penal Legions, and multiple regiments of the Tarax Guard. We then finally have the 7th army group, Fire and Ice, led by General Silas of Laurentine, composed of multiple regiments of Katachan Jungle Fighters, multiple regiments of the Holland Ice Warriors, and multiple regiments of the Jackal's Imperial Guard Regiment. In addition to this, elements of the following Adeptus Astartes chapters also assisted in the crusade: the Death Spectres, the Doom Warriors, the Inceptors, the Marines Malevolent, and the Star Phantoms. Elements of the Imperial Navy also aided in the crusade, though we are unsure of the numbers, but it was enough to ferry the massive force and to safeguard it. In addition to this, naval elements of the Adeptus Astartes and an unknown number of Aeronautica Imperialis wings of various aircraft were also joined. Many Night Houses and Titan Legios answered the call, and with the massive machines of the Imperium came their priests and wards, as the Adeptus Mechanicus were also present, represented by their cohorts of Skitari, Automata Tagmata, and Tech Priest Covens. Yet the size of these forces paled in comparison to the number of the Imperial Guard, who were the true backbone of the crusade, with the vast majority of the regiments being heavy infantry, which together with massed artillery were formed an implacable wall of fire that would slowly crush the enemy underfoot. Or there would be a stalwart anvil to check the enemy where they stood, making them a prime target for the armored regiments, which would either outflank or simply sunder the enemy forces before wheeling about and destroying the enemy held in place by the heavy infantry, with lighter elements such as light infantry, jump infantry, and lighter vehicles forming a screen for both the heavy infantry and armor alike, with air and naval assets claiming dominance in the sky and void respectively. The Admech, Space Marines, Night Houses, and Titan Legions had their own leeway to do as they wished, but they were more than willing to answer requests for aid from the various army groups. Whilst all the army groups operated with this as their base tactic and setup, each army group would develop their own preferences while the crusade progressed. Sadly, we don't have much information on how they diverged, but we can make some educated guesses based on the information that we have presented. We may assume that the 4th Army Group would develop a great expertise in armored warfare due to having a high number of Talon tank regiments and Armageddon Steel Legion mechanized infantry regiments, or the 7th, who would become known for their light infantry due to the high volume of Katachan jungle fighters and Valhallan ice warriors. We could also speculate that the 6th would often operate in regions where supply was hard to come by, or they faced enemies and foes which were often terrible battles, hence how they came to know the term Hard Luck 6. But regardless of these possibilities, after the fall of the Lord Solar, these army groups would splinter along with their generals. Sadly, we don't know the fate of each army group or each regiment, but we can make some educated guesses, like how many regiments would most likely side with the Imperium rather than any way breakaway state, such as all the Deathcore of Krieg and Cadian regiments who are known for their loyalty. We can also assume the Donian regiments stayed loyal as well, as Donia was already a staunch Imperial world, and to see their great lord's work sullied by his successors would not have sat well with them. Combine these reasonings with the fact that these three made up the bulk of the first army group, and the fact that said group was directly under the Lord Solar himself, and thus most loyal to him, I think it's fair to say that the first army group would have sided with the Loyalists. I also believe that the second army group would have also sided with the Loyalists, but for a less logical reason. Sejanus was the commander of the second army group, and was said to be the best friend of Macarius and his closest companion, and given how closely Macarius mirrors Alexander the Great, I believe that Sejanus is the mirror of Hephaestion, one of Alexander's top generals, his closest friend, and would some speculate to be his possible lover. Maybe. We don't really know. I mean, Alexander was a fan of penetrating from the rear. In any regard, given how close and loyal Sejanus was, it is likely that he too would side with the Imperium, if for nothing else than not wanting to smear his friend's legacy with the dark mark of betrayal. But whereas my other guesses were educated, this one is purely a shot in the dark based on feelings. In summary, the aftermath of the Macarian Crusade, the Macarian heresy would begin, and the Retribution Force would be led primarily by elements of over 100 Space Marine chapters, who were joined by loyalist elements of the Crusade. Though, it must be stated we don't have any concrete numbers. But it would be enough to see the flag of the Imperium fly over the conquered worlds, even if that flag was now soaked in blood, even more so than usual. Thus, we are brought to the end of the story of the Lord Solar Macharius. But how did this legend compare to his earlier exploits? Let us now find out as we take a look at the story of the greatest Alexander to have ever lived. Alexander III of Macedon was born in Pella, the capital of the ancient Macedonian kingdom, on the 6th day of the ancient Greek month of Hakabation, what we believe to be the 20th of July, 356 BC, son of the soldier king Philip II and his fourth wife, Princess Olympia, daughter of Neptimius I, king of the kingdom of Epirus. And from the get-go, before we even begun with its actual history, the myths of this Macedonian prince are many and grandiose. From how both his parents had dreams that suggested he was son of none other than Zeus himself, to how the day of his birth many great deeds and miracles were said to have taken place, such as how Philip received news that Parmenion, his royal general, had defeated the combined armies of both Illyria and Pannonia, and that his horses had won the Olympic Games. How the great temple of Artemis in Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was said to have burned down. According to Hegasius of Magnesia, a Greek historian, said temple had only burned because Artemis was away attending the birth of her new kin, Alexander. And while many of these tales came after Alexander had been crowned king, and some even after his death, the fact that people would so readily believe them is testament to, if nothing else, the magnitude of the deeds Alexander would accomplish. Alexander's youth was no different than that of any young Macedonian prince. He was raised by his nurse, Lanki, who was the sister to Alexander's future general, Clytus the Black, who would save Alexander's life, and have a great impact on the young king's life. He was tutored in many things, learning to read, play the lyre, ride, fight, and hunt, as well as studying the classic Greek academics, such as medicine, philosophy, morals, religion, logic, mathematics, oratory, physics, science, and the various arts. For he was tutored by many people, including Leonidas of Epirus, a relative of his mother, and Lyximenes of Arcania. But his most famous tutor would be the legendary philosopher Aristotle. Under the great philosopher's tutelage, Alexander developed a passion for the works of Homer, in particular the Iliad, which no doubt had a great influence on his life. As for matters of the sword, that is where the Masia, or the Academy, would come into play. This was an elite military academy which trained the entire Macedonian cavalry, and Alexander was part of the most elite of formation, the Companions, which were made up of the most noble sons of Macedon, and would form a personal cavalry guard for the king. And it is here that Alexander would meet many of his friends, whom he would become his generals and then his successors. During his youth, Alexander would not only excel in his studies and training, but also accomplish great deeds, even at such a young age. For when Alexander was 10 years old, A trader from Thessaly brought Philip a horse. He would then offer the king to sell said horse to him for 13 talents, no small sum of money at the time. The horse, however, refused to be mounted. Philip, believing the horse to be mad, ordered it away. Alexander, however, had noticed that the horse had feared his own shadow. He would then ask his father to tame the horse. His father would then allow. Plutarch records that Alexander's father was so overjoyed by this display of courage and vision that he was said to have kissed his son tearfully and declare, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambition, or Macedon is too small for you." Such words would prove to be prophetic, if nothing else. For Philip's father would then purchase the horse for the boy, and Alexander would name it Bucephalus, meaning ox-head or bull-headed. Bucephalus would carry Alexander as far as India, where he would then pass, either due to old age or being wounded in battle. Alexander would so love his companion that he would name a city after him, Bucephalus. However, at the age of 16, his tutelage would end, and his military career would begin. Philip would wage a war in northern Thrace, and leave Alexander as his heir apparent, with him in charge in theory if not in practice. From the outset, Alexander's military talent would be on full display, as revolts in central and southern Thrace would be dealt with by him, with Philip joining Alexander in the latter, where reportedly Alexander would save his father's life. In 338 BC, Philip would set his sights on the rest of Greece, with Alexander joining him on his campaign. Alexander had been ordered to muster an army for the campaign, and concerned that the Greeks may become wise to what he was doing, Alexander made it look like he was preparing to invade Illyria instead, only for said Illyrians to invade Macedonia and run right into Alexander, who just so happened to be waiting for them. The campaign was quick, and the combined military leadership of Philip and his generals, which now counted a young Alexander, as well as the sheer indomitable might of the Macedonian phalanx, would find the Greeks wanting. In the climactic battle of Chaeronea, Philip would lead his right wing. Philip would feign a retreat and draw the inexperienced Athenian hoplites into his trap. At the same time, Alexander would smash through the Theban lines with the vaunted companion cavalry. With this twofold move, the Greek army was broken and easily defeated. After this, the Macedonians would eject Sparta from much of Lacedaemon. Yet, they were unable or unwilling to conquer Sparta proper, and thus the Greek states were cowed, save for the old line of Laconia. At Corinth, Philip would establish the Hellenic Alliance, or the Hellenic League, or League of Corinth, with Philip as hegemon, which translates roughly to supreme commander or overall ruler. With Greece subdued, even if momentarily, Philip would announce his next target, the Persian Empire. In the same year, Philip would marry Cleopatra Eudoxie, a niece of one of his generals, Attilatus, thus making Alexander's status as heir uncertain, as any sons born from Cleopatra would have a more rightful claim to the throne, as they would be fully Macedonian, whereas Alexander was only half. All this would come to a head when during the wedding feast, a drunken Attilatus would publicly pray to the gods that his niece give Macedon a true heir, slandering both Alexander and his mother. Plutarch recounts the events as such. At the wedding of Cleopatra, whom Philip fell in love with and married, she being much too young for him, her uncle, Attilatus, in his drink, desired the Macedonians would implore the gods to give them a lawful successor to the kingdom by his niece. This so irritated Alexander that, throwing one of his cups at his head, "You villain! What am I then? A bastard?" Then Philip, taking Attilatus' part, rose up and would have his son run through, but by good fortune for them both, either due to his over-hasty rage or the wine he had drunk, made his foot slip, and so he fell on the floor, at which Alexander reproachfully insulted him. "See there, the man who makes preparations to pass of Europe into Asia, overturning in passing from one seat to another." The fallout of this event would see both Alexander and his mother flee in exile in 337 BC, first to the court of the kingdom of Epirus, then to that of the Illyrians. Though it must be mentioned that Philip never disowned his son, nor did it seem like it planned to. Regardless, after 6 months of exile, Alexander and his mother would return to Macedon, thanks to the great efforts of Demetrius, a family friend. Tensions were smoothed over, and all grievances apparently forgotten, at least for now. On the 24th day of the Macedonian month of Dios, which we believe to be the 25th of October, 336 BC, would be the day where the world as we know would have been irreversibly changed. On that day, while in Achaea, attending the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra to Olympias' his brother, Alexander I of Epirus, Philip was assassinated by the captain of his bodyguards, Pausanias. As to why, we don't know. The Greeks went that he was bribed with by the great king Darius, who was fearful of the impending invasion. But the evidence for this is shaky. The most prevailing theory, or more accurately the theory that everyone agrees on, is that Philip allowed Pausanias to be sexually violated by a Greek noble. This act would cause Pausanias to take revenge in the form of murder, which makes sense to anyone with a brain. There were countless other theories, which can mostly be summed up with the phrase cutthroat court politics. But regardless, the result is the same. Philip was dead, and Alexander, at the age of 20, was now king of Macedon and hegemon of the Hellenic League, with the known world watching to see what he would do. And what great deeds he would do indeed. Like all monarchs of the past, and most leaders of the past and present, the first acts of Alexander's reign would see him consolidate his power base, and ensure that all saw him as Macedonia's true and rightful king. He had his cousin, the former Athenius IV, executed. We don't know the reasoning, but it could be that Alexander saw him as a threat to the throne, or it could be for a number of reasons. He also had 2 Macedonian princes from the region of Lysinikis killed for having been involved in his father's assassination. It is widely agreed upon that this theory holds water, but then again we are uncertain, as we would truly never know many of the finer details of Alexander's life. Yet, Alexander's mother Olympias would not rely on her son, but rather acting on her own accord. Without consent of Alexander, she would have Cleopatra Eudices and Europa, her daughter by Philip, murdered via being burnt alive. When Alexander learned of this, he was supposedly outraged by the needless death. Alexander would then order the murder of Autolycus. Now this was for a multitude of reasons. For one, Autolycus never liked Alexander, let alone be loyal to him. Thus, he was far less likely to support him as king. He was the commander of the foothold Macedon held within the Asian Minor, via the straits of modern-day Gallipoli, that being the Hellespont, meaning he controlled who entered Asia. He was allegedly already in talks with the Athens about a revolt, and the final cherry on this murder cake, Olympias had just murdered his daughters and granddaughter, rather cruelly I might add, meaning that if Autolycus was a threat before, he was a calamity now. But he would be slain, and command of the Asian foothold fell to Parmenion. Yet, while Macedonia was calm, Greece was anything but, as Thebes, Athens, Thessaly, and Thrace all rose in revolt. Yet, Alexander, true to form, would move quickly and aggressively. Mustering 3,000 heavy cavalry, he would outmaneuver the Thessalian army which blocked his path, quickly earning their subjugation and loyalty, before moving through the rest of Greece. The sudden appearance of the faraway boy king, stampeding towards them at the head of a vengeful host, seemingly appearing as if they had descended from the heavens upon bolts of lightning, was enough for the Greeks to reject the idea of revolt, and acknowledge Alexander as hegemon of Greece. For now. Alexander, satisfied by this, would then move to the Balkans and Thrace to crush the tribes into their submission, so that they would not have the strength nor will to attack when he was campaigning in Asia. In a series of battles, he would defeat both armies of Thrace and Illyria, with a famous exploit during the Battle of Ilium, where Alexander, surrounded and on the verge of destruction, arrayed his army, and then had them perform marches and drills. Such was the prowess of the Macedonians that the tribesmen of the Tatolanti were shocked and stunned. So shocked and stunned that they did not realize the Macedonians had begun to maneuver towards them. They had not hope in either courage nor arms to stand against the sons of Macedon, and Alexander would then be free to retreat across the river, stopping Atalanti's attempt to halt them, only for Alexander to come back and attack at night while the Tatolanti had their guard down. The subsequent massacre spelt the end of the Illyrian threat. In one day and one night, Alexander had turned near total defeat into guaranteed absolute victory. Back to the near-comical actions of the Greeks, a rumor had spread that Alexander and his army had been defeated, but not only defeated, but utterly destroyed, with Alexander slain. Not bothering to clarify this, and seemingly forgetting the speed which Alexander can move, many Greek cities returned to open revolt, with Athens and Thebes going so far as to kill the Macedonian garrisons, and draw up plans for war. To say that Alexander was upset by this was equal to saying that the sun gave up some heat. He would march his force down to southern Greece, with all cities in his path not daring to oppose the lightning bolt of a ruler, all except for Thebes, who would deny the king entry. The siege would be bloody and brutal, but relatively quick. The Macedonians with vengeance burning bright in their chest, and the Thebans fighting for their very existence. Yet, in the end, Alexander's forces would prove to be vastly superior, and as the walls of the city fell, so too did the life of the city. As Alexander's punishment was brutal as it was total, Thebes was razed to the ground, completely, wholly, and utterly destroyed, its army slaughtered, and the remaining inhabitants sold into slavery. A lightning bolt had come to Thebes, and struck it a blow most foul. with some rumors claiming Thebes would continue to be abandoned until the time of the Romans, nearly over 200 years later. With this act, Athens and the rest of Greece now truly acknowledged Alexander as hegemon of all Greece. Alexander, either satisfied or completely fed up with the whole ordeal, declared the matter dealt with and left Antipater as regent of Europe, as he would finally see justice rendered unto his father and the countless Greeks before him, as Alexander would begin the invasion of the greatest empire of the known world, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. In 334 BC, Alexander would cross the Hellespont with anywhere from 35 to 50,000 men, as we have no direct sources, and what sources we do have are conflicting. But most modern historians tend to agree on a number of around 40,000 men at the start of the conquest, with about 34,000 being infantry, 2/3 of these being heavy infantry, consisting of 9,000 Macedonian phalandrites, armed with the deadly sarissa, 3,000 hypaspis, or shield-bearer, the elite heavy infantry of the Macedonian army, equipped in the style of classic hoplites, but with the finest arms and armor, and the rest being traditional Greek hoplites, a mixture of Greek allies, levies, and mercenaries, with the final third being light infantry, mainly from Thrace and the Balkans, with 1,000 being the elite Cretan archers, and another 1,000 being the elite Agrianis javelin throwers. These two units would become favored by Alexander, as he would use them often. In addition to this, Alexander would have about 6,000 cavalry, with 1,800 being the elite Macedonian heavy cavalry, known as the Companions, or Hetairoi, 1,800 being Thessalian heavy cavalry, and the rest being light cavalry, from mounted archers from the steppe to mounted scouts from the Balkans. Again, these numbers are not concrete, but they are our best guess, and are correct within a few thousand here and there. Alexander also possessed a fleet of 120 ships, both warships like the quadrim, and troop transports and supply ships. As Alexander crossed into Asia, he met little opposition. Greek cities welcomed him, and no Persian city dared to refuse him. Yet there was a reason for this, as the Persian governors of Anatolia, known as satraps, as they ruled over satrapies, Persian provinces, gathered at Zelia to discuss how to end the threat of Alexander. Memnon of Rhodes, a well-renowned Greek mercenary general employed by the Persians, suggested a strategy of scorched earth, destroying everything they couldn't carry and allowing Alexander's army to starve themselves into submission or death. The advice was sound, and the Persians had reason to trust Memnon, as it was he who had crushed the revolt of the Anatolian Greek cities a few months prior. Yet what Memnon asked of them was too much. The Persians would not burn their homes to the ground, the very things they were meant to defend. No, the Persians would fight the Greek invaders with all the might they could muster, and they would choose to do so at the river Granicus. In May of 334 BC, Alexander would hear of a Persian army that had finally been seen at the river Granicus. Alexander thanked Zeus for this opportunity, and gathered his most elite forces and raced to the river to do battle with the Persians. The Persians numbered anywhere from 14 to 40,000, but again, most historians agree approximately 10 to 12,000 cavalry, half being heavy cataphracti-style lancers, the other half being light mounted archers and other light cavalry. They would form the front line, an infantry reserve of approximately 10,000, most of whom were Greek mercenaries in the style of hoplites and some lighter Persian levies. They would be the reserve line. Rumor has it that this is because the Persians were unsure if they could trust the Greek mercenaries to fight against other Greeks. Little did they know about the enmity that other Greeks had for other Greeks. The army was most likely led by Aristes, the governor of the invaded provinces. Alexander had with him approximately 18,000 men, 1,800 Thessalian cavalry, and 1,500 Greek cavalry on the left flank, led by Parmenion, 9,000 phalangites at the center in their divisions, each led by their respective commander. The right flank, commanded by Alexander himself, was with his 1,800 companion cavalry, 500 Agrianis, 500 Cretans, and his 3,000 Hypaspists. Yet the problem for the Macedonians was not that they were slightly outnumbered. It was that a river separated them from the enemy, and the enemy was waiting. Alexander, personally leading the right wing, called out to his men to have great courage on this day, as he led the charge across the river. The Persians, seeing the enemy king apparently throwing himself at them, charged to meet him, intent on cutting his reign short. As Alexander's right wing met the Persian left, a brutal clash ensued. Yet while Alexander's attack might seem reckless, and it was to a degree, there was a reason for it. Alexander hoped to buy time for his rigid phalanx to cross the river unmolested, and he planned to do that by distracting the Persians with himself, dangling his head, offering the Persians to take it. And indeed, it worked. Almost too well. During the heat of the battle, Rosasinius, scion of a noble Persian house, wielding his blade, struck Alexander, king of the Greeks, upon his head. But his helmet took the force of the blow and broke it, leaving the king unharmed. Able of both body and mind, wielded his lance, Alexander wielded his lance and struck down the Persian noble. Yet at the same time, another noble of the Persian line, known as Mithridates, came upon him from behind and raised his sword, intent on laying the king low. But Black Clitus interceded on his liege's behalf and struck Mithridates upon the arm with his sword, removing the arm, saber and all. Mithridates, overcome by pain, was laid low and writhed upon the floor. Despite the dangers the foe impressed upon him, Alexander's stratagem had worked, for his mighty phalanx had crossed the river with no hindrance from the foe and advanced forth into the Persian line. And such was the strength of the Greeks, and so weakened had the hearts of the Persians been by the defiance of Alexander, that they lost heart and routed upon meeting their foe. Many were slain, yet many more escaped as they were mounted upon horseback. Yet for those upon foot, whether ensnared by blind rage induced by the spilling of blood, or whether he saw the men before him as oath-breakers and traitors, one cannot say. Only that what followed was a slaughter most foul. Many died, and what remained, some numbering 2,000, were taken back to Greece as slaves, where 5,500 Persians, most of them scions of noble houses, falling before the blades of the Macedonians, with only 115 Greeks claimed in return. With this victory, did Alexander claim all of Asia Minor and the lands within as his own, by right of conquest. The victory would open up Asia Minor to Alexander, and he would conquer every city in his path, with little to no resistance, such as when he reached Sardis, the capital of the Lydian satrapy, where the commander surrendered the city without even a fight. Here, Alexander would claim not only a moral victory, but also a physical one, as he gained access to the stockpiles and treasury of Sardis. Both were well kept. Alexander's next goal was to secure his supply lines by defeating the Persian navy. For while the Macedonian navy was good, the Persian navy was simply better. In fact, Memnon of Rhodes would lead several naval campaigns, which saw the Macedonians lose decisively, and even some Greek islands captured. Alexander then decided what he could not take by sea, he would take by land, as he would lay siege and capture the naval bases and ports of the Persian fleet, rendering them useless, as without a base, they could not operate. His first two targets were the cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus. Both would prove hard fights and difficult sieges, as in the case of the former, Persian naval superiority made it tricky, and in the case of the latter, the defenders and those who would lead them were equal parts brave and tenacious. But in the end, after a few months of hard siege, they were taken, the Greek lands effectively safe from Persian naval raids. Alexander would then proceed into the mountainous Lycidia and the plains of Paphlagonia, where he would finally seize the land of Phrygia by taking the ancient capital city of Gordonium, where the legendary Gordian knot was kept, a massive ball of tangled rope. An ancient prophecy said that only he who was destined to be king of all Asia could undo this knot. Alexander simply drew his sword and cut it in half, undoing the knot, which gave rise to one of my favorite sayings, cutting the Gordian knot, aka solving a complex solution with a simple problem. And it is a damn crime that it isn't more widely appreciated. In 333 BC, Alexander would make his way out of Anatolia by conquering the Taurus mountains and entering Sicilia, though Alexander would take ill during this time, and while he would recover, a lengthy pause was required to tend to the king, much to Alexander's dismay, though he had no say in the matter given his condition. After his recovery, Alexander would continue his march into Syria, leaving Parmenion with a small garrison to guard the area around Issus, which is where later Antioch would be built. He also left his sick and wounded to recover there as well. However, due to this lengthy pause, and excellent generalship on his part, Darius was able to outflank Alexander and strike him from the rear. Instead of assaulting Parmenion's garrison at the Pass of Jonah, Darius instead went to what he thought was the main Greek camp, but what he found was Alexander sick and wounded. It is unknown what specifically drove Darius to commit his next action, whether it was anger at not finding Alexander, his hatred for what he saw as invaders destroying his land, or maybe it was a cruel but calculated way to rid Alexander fighting men, but still burdening his supply train. Whatever the reason, the bloody result is the same. Every one of the sick and wounded had both their hands cut off. When Alexander heard of these events, he was set to fly into a rage, hurling various obscenities at Darius and Persia both. Alexander then turned his army around and marched directly to meet Darius in open battle. At the same time, Darius would march south to face him, but would stop at the river Prinarus when his scouts alerted him that Alexander's army was within distance. Surprised by Alexander's speed, he was forced to make camp in the narrow coastal plain at Issus, with the sea on his right flank. For the next day, the sea would be witness to the beginning of the end of Persian power. The order of battle is as follows. As always, the numbers are contentious, with some ancient sources giving as much as 600,000, which is beyond unbelievable. Even at its height, the Persian Empire never fielded an army close to 500,000, let alone 600,000. While modern scholars debate this number, it is widely agreed upon that the Persian army numbered just over 100,000, with the upper limit being 120,000. This being my personal belief. As if one considers the Persian army from the Granicus, who did manage to retreat relatively intact, it is possible to reach that number. The right wing was composed of approximately 11 to 13,000 cavalry, both light and heavy, with the most elite cavalry being placed there. The center was composed of 10,000 Greek mercenaries, and 10,000 of the most feared warriors of the Persian Empire, and the only true heavy infantry Persia possessed, the personal household guard of the King of Kings, the Immortals. So called for the number never dropped below 10,000. These, with the Greeks, formed the center, commanded by Darius himself, along with his personal cavalry guard. The rest of the army was made of various light infantry from across the empire, which formed the left and the reserve, along with some light cavalry. The Macedonian army mirrored that of the Battle of Granicus, with Parmenion commanding the left, made up of Thessalian and allied Greek cavalry, as well as an infantry reserve. The center was home to the Phalangites, with the Greek hoplites forming a second reserve line. Alexander commanded the right, made up of the Companions, Hypaspes, Arianes, and Cretans, with some light infantry in reserve, and the rest deployed as a screen in front of the main force. Approximately 37,000 Greeks in total stood before the Emperor of all Persia. Regardless of who you believe on numbers, Alexander was outnumbered, and unlike the Granicus, not by an insignificant amount. Darius' plan was to mass his right wing and use his powerful cataphracts to smash the enemy's left, and then encircle them before destroying them outright. However, Alexander would once again prove to be the deciding factor, as while any normal general would be on the defensive when facing against a larger foe, Alexander was anything but normal. He would call on his men to be brave, calling some of them out by name, recounting tales of their bravery, before charging forth into the enemy, his whole army following behind him. As Alexander smashed into the Persian left, the lightly armored Persians stood no chance against the armored mass of man and horse. Led by a seeming madman, they tried to withstand the foe, but were quickly undone and routed. However, the rest of Alexander's army was not faring well. His center, in a rush to follow their king, had to pass through uneven ground at a rapid pace, which led to the formation breaking apart, meaning that they were essentially useless when engaged with the Greek hoplites and Persian immortals. Once again, Alexander's speed would be his saving grace, as seeing this, he turned from the fleeing Persians and slammed into the enemy heavy infantry, who under such a devastating assault were forced to disengage and allow his phalangites to reform their ranks and unleash their true destructive potential. Alexander then redoubled his assault in the center. The phalanx, now properly deployed, steamrolled through the Persian center, with the Hypaspes punching a hole clean through the Persian flank, which allowed the companion cavalry under Alexander to strike at Darius himself. Darius, upon seeing the bolt of lightning and death that was Alexander the Great, broke and fled, and crashed right into his Greek mercenary reserves, breaking their cohesion, as well as any chance of them deploying to the field. And with him, so too did the Persian center rout. And not a moment too soon. At the same time Alexander charged the Persian left, the Persian cataphracts had charged the Greek left, and Parmenion was stretched thin. His Greeks were hard pressed, and they were said to only have held the Persians due to their sheer determination and refusal to break, despite the grievous losses they suffered. Yet their iron resolve would bear fruit, as when the Persian right saw their king flee, and Alexander hurling towards them, they too broke and fled, with the whole Persian army in a rout, and the Macedonians, with vengeance in their hearts, pursued them as long as there was light, and even a little after that. So grievous were their losses that Ptolemy was said to have told Alexander that while pursuing the Persians, they came across a small ravine and were able to cross it by filling it with Persian dead, with still many bodies left over. All in all, the Greeks were said to have suffered 5,000 casualties, a vast majority of them being wounded cavalrymen who fought on the left flank. The Persians, however, were said to have lost a full third of their army. In our case, that would be over 40,000 men. In addition to these grievous losses, the Persians also lost their entire baggage train, which included part of the royal treasury, and Darius himself lost his family. As so sure was the King of Kings that he would triumph over Alexander, that he brought his family to watch, with his wife, Stephara I, his daughters, Stephara II and Rapinis, and his mother, Sisamgibius, being captured. Yet, Alexander was said to have treated them with the utmost respect, as if they were his own family. He would even later marry one of Darius' daughter, Stephara II. With this battle, not only had Darius lost his family, but also now Syria, the Levant, and Egypt. For Alexander had come. After this disaster, Darius would offer Alexander peace. Everything west of the Euphrates River would be his, as well as a very large sum of gold and the hand of his daughter in marriage. Alexander, however, would not even consider this. As to him, Earth had only one son, so too can Asia only have one king. With the famous account apparently going where Parmenion would have spoken to Alexander saying, "If I were Alexander, I would accept this offer," and Alexander apparently replying, "If I were Parmenion, I too would accept this offer." And thus, the war continued. Alexander would continue his strategy of conquering Persian naval bases, by conquering those on the Levantine coast, with the final one being the most grueling, that being the siege of the island city of Tyre, which forced Alexander to launch a brutal 8th-month siege, in which Alexander's army was forced to build a massive land bridge to connect the island to the land. Such was the defiance of the city, and so great were the losses that the Macedonians had suffered in both time and men, that when the city fell, Alexander ordered the city sacked and razed, with every male of fighting age slain, and the remaining population sold into slavery. Alexander would continue down the Levantine coast, meeting little resistance, until he came across the city of Gaza, which put up great resistance, requiring a great siege, as it was in Tyre. And just as it was in Tyre, men of military age were put to the sword, and women and children were sold into slavery. It is important to note that these instances of brutality were very rare, as every instance being able to be counted on two hands, as Alexander's policy to conquer populations was to treat them with as much respect as possible. Alexander would then continue into Egypt, where the people there, long chafed under Persian rule, ever since the Persian had disregarded their religious sanctity, welcomed him as a liberator. He would make his way to the oracle of Amun-Ra, at the Siwa Oasis in the Libyan desert, where he would be proclaimed son of Amun. This was most likely done to legitimize him as an heir to the legacy of past pharaohs. Yet, this also led credence to the claim that Zeus was his father, as Amun was the Egypt equivalent of Zeus, and it is said that from now on, Alexander himself would refer to Amun-Zeus as his true father. Alexander would stay in Egypt for a few months, as he reformed the taxation on the Greek models and organized the military occupation and administration of the country. He would also form a new city at the mouth of the Nile, known as Alexandria. However, in early 331 BC, Alexander would emerge from Egypt and resume his conquest of the Persian Empire. Alexander would march eastward into Achaemenid Assyria in Upper Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and made for the Tigris River, heading for the heartland of the Persian Empire. Darius was not idle during this time. He had raised another army and had sent Mazaeus, satrap of Cilicia, with a force of 3,000 cavalry to guard the crossing of the Euphrates near Thapsacus. While Mazaeus was supposed to delay the Macedonian army, he would be shocked, for he would see the mighty army approaching from the north rather than the south as he had expected. When this occurred, he took his men and returned back to Darius. Alexander had chosen the longer northern route, as it was easier to forage for supplies, and as troops would not suffer the extreme heat of the quicker but more dangerous southern route, as the northern route had the waters of the Euphrates and the mountains of Armenia to nourish and shade his troops. This uncharacteristically cautious approach surprised Mazaeus and Darius both, and thus the Macedonian army was able to cross the river a few days later. Alexander's army would spot a few stragglers of Mazaeus' cavalry and managed to capture them, upon which they revealed that Darius' army was camped at Gaugamela. Alexander would then order his army to make for Gaugamela, for there would the fate of the Persian Empire be decided. In regards to the order of battle, we have something new. All historians mutually agree on the numbers. For the Macedonians, 40 to 47,000 men in total, consisting of 24 to 31,000 heavy infantry, including 9,000 phalangites, 3,000 hypaspis, and the rest being mercenaries and allied Greek hoplites. An important note is that Alexander was continually receiving reinforcements from Macedon, the rest of the infantry, approximately 9,000, being light infantry, 1,000 being the elite Agrianis javelin throwers, and another 1,000 being the elite Cretan archers. And finally, the army was rounded up with about 7,000 cavalry, split between light and heavy cavalry respectively. The order of battle was established by now, with Parmenion on the left, the phalanx in the center, and Alexander and his elites on the right. As for the Persians, as I said, all historians agree on the numbers, and how we have no numbers. The historical figures given are so absurd that not even those living at the time believe them, with no archaeological evidence being able to help us, as we don't know where the battle took place in relation to the modern day. So all we can say for certain is that Alexander was outnumbered. As for what I think 120,000 is fair, as it means that the Persian Empire would have been able to muster about 300,000 men in total during the duration of the war, which makes sense in relation to their size. But again, we really have no idea. As for command, Darius would take the center, Mosaius commanded the right, and Bessus, satrap of the east, would take command of the left. The Persian army consisted of every people within the empire: Syrian, Median, Mesopotamian, Parthian, Sacian, Tapurian, Icarian, Corsican Albanian, Sacian, Cappadocian, Bactrians, Armenians, and Indian cavalry. Armadi and Mardi archers, Greek mercenaries, and the famed Persian immortals, including infantry from all over the empire, and Darius' most prized units, 200 scythe chariots and 15 Indian war elephants, though the war elephants did not participate in the battle. The Macedonians would form for battle, with both flanks angled inwards at 45 degrees, and would slowly begin to advance. Darius' plan was to wait for the Macedonians to advance over the flat ground, which he had made himself, as he ordered his men to clear the area of any debris, hold them at the center while he overloaded his right flank with extra infantry and cavalry to overwhelm the flank and strike from the rear. As the Macedonians began to close, Alexander would begin his plan. He, together with his right wing, began dashing to the right. To Darius and the Persians, it looked like Alexander was trying to envelop the larger army with his smaller force, a hopeless endeavor, as he would be surrounded and destroyed by the Persian elite cavalry. Bessus would follow Alexander and strike his flank hard, just as Alexander wanted. But when Bessus had followed far enough that he could not undo his maneuver, Alexander revealed his trap, as his right-wing cavalry smashed into the Persian left. A screen of Arianis and Cretans would deploy on the left flank of the Macedonian right wing, preventing the Persians from following Alexander, as he, with his most elite companion cavalry, made for the gap created by Bessus, a gap that led straight for Darius. Darius, his hand forced by Alexander's sudden movement, was forced to act first, against his wishes. In hopes to break the Macedonian center, he deployed his scythe chariots to break the Macedonians. Yet Alexander had instructed his men on how to deal with the chariots, as when the chariots charged, they were showered with missiles, and the phalanx opened their ranks, creating wide corridors for the chariots to pass harmlessly through, which would lead them right into the missiles of awaiting light infantry, where they were promptly murdered. The mighty phalanx would then slowly begin pushing back against the Persian center, with Alexander making his charge towards Darius. The elite hypospis were launched in force at the gap in the line, and the juggernaut of heavy infantry smashed a hole clean through the Persian lines, which gave Alexander his chance to strike at Darius himself, coming within inches of slaying the Persian emperor. But once again, Darius would flee, and his center would collapse. Yet, as Alexander was preparing to hunt down Darius, he was delivered with terrible news. Darius' plan had worked. Parmenion had held for as long as he could, but the sheer weight of heavy infantry and heavy cavalry reinforcements that the Persians had sent proved to be too much, as the Persians had made a hole in the Macedonian left wing, with Scythian light cavalry making their way towards the Macedonian baggage train. Alexander was faced with a choice: pursue and kill Darius, risking his entire army, or save his army and face the King of Kings on another day. Alexander would choose his army, as he would leave reinforcements and slam into the Persian left, overwhelming and breaking them, saving his army and winning the battle. Casualty reports are again uncertain. The Macedonians suffered light casualties, with anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 killed and wounded. As for the Persian army, scholars agree that most of the army was either killed, wounded, or captured. It was a complete, total, and decisive victory, with the Persian baggage train captured, which had about 4,000 talents of gold, the king's chariot, bow, and war elephants all included. Alexander would shortly then enter Babylon, the capital of the Persian Empire. Alexander would make his intentions known, with Babylonian sources saying the following: that the king of the world, Alexander, sent his scouts with a message to the people of Babylon before entering the city: "I shall not enter your houses." The people of Babylon were said to have welcomed the merciful Alexander. Whether it was out of fear or genuine thanks, we cannot say. What we can say, though, is that Alexander had captured the capital of the Persian Empire without a single drop of blood lost, and had left both the city and its people unmolested. From there, he would capture Susa, a Persian provincial capital. He would then take a hand-picked force and make for the ceremonial capital of Persepolis, where he would be stopped at the Persian gates, a narrow mountain pass located in the modern-day Zagros Mountains, which had been blocked by a Persian army under Arabazanes. This force would block Alexander for a few days, before Alexander would outflank them and destroy the force, which ironically was a mirror of the Battle of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, during the Greco-Persian Wars, nearly 150 years ago. Alexander would make his way to the great Persian city, where he would unleash his men upon the city and sack it for 5 straight days. This was not done on a whim, however, as Alexander was said to have done this in retribution for the Persian sacking of Athens 150 years ago. During this time, a fire would break out and burn down most of the city. While facts surrounding the fire and the sacking of the city are hazy, we can say 2 things for certain. Alexander did order the sack, and when he saw the damage it caused, he would regret it most deeply. Alexander would stay in Persepolis for a few months, before resuming the chase after Darius. During this time, Spartan king Agis III would raise a revolt, utilizing many of the former Greek mercenaries in Persian employ. After an initial victory over Macedon, he would be defeated and killed by Antipater in the Battle of Megalopolis. Antipater would refer the Spartans' punishment to the League of Corinth, which in return deferred to Alexander, who was hegemon, who chose to pardon Sparta. Again, whether this was out of mercy or simply not caring, we do not know. As for Darius, the Persian emperor may have been defeated, but he was not broken. With what little remained of his army, he would take them east, and gather the eastern satraps, and raise a new army to fight Alexander, and hopefully bring him to the negotiating table. Yet while the king showed resolve worthy of his ancestors, his followers did not, as Bessus, satrap of the east, would betray Darius and murder the great king of Persia, leaving him to burn in the sun, as he would declare himself Atraxes V, the new king of kings of the Persian Empire. Alexander and his men would find Darius, and before he died, he was said to have named Alexander his successor. And while there is obvious reason for Alexander to lie here, we ultimately don't know. And considering how Alexander was treating his people and his family, and how the other guy had just stabbed him to death, in his final moments he might have liked Alexander more than Bessus. But then again, we will never know. Alexander, for his part, would express great sadness that a king would die in such a manner. He would return Darius' body to Persepolis and bury him with the traditional honors of a Persian king, and would have him be laid to rest in the royal catacombs of Persia, along with the great kings of old. Alexander, wanting to be seen as a successor, and possibly genuinely upset at this, given his past and the fate of his own father, vowed to hunt down Bessus and punish him accordingly. The campaign would see him chase Bessus across what remained of the Persian Empire, with Alexander claiming all the territory that he traveled through, with only minor skirmishes and brief sieges occurring. This all came to a head in 329 BC, where Spitamenes, a noble from the Sogdian satrapy, betrayed Bessus and captured him. He was then brought to Ptolemy in chains, who then brought him to Alexander. Alexander would have Bessus executed as a betrayer and a kingslayer. However, Spitamenes' loyalty would be short-lived, as when Alexander was campaigning under the Atraxas River, dealing with an incursion by a nomadic horse army, Spitamenes would rise in open revolt against Alexander, trying to break away with the satrapy of Sogdia. Alexander would personally defeat the Scythians at the Battle of Aretaxtes. He would then immediately pivot and launch a campaign against Spitamenes, ultimately easily defeating him in the Battle of Gaba. After said defeat, Spitamenes, in a twist of irony, would be killed by his own men, where they came to Alexander to sue for peace, which he accepted. And with this, Alexander had effectively conquered the Persian Empire, with none able nor willing to question him as the true Shah and Shah. Yet Alexander was still not done. After dealing with the Sogdian revolt, Alexander would marry his first wife, Roxana, the daughter of an Iranian satrap, which caused much discontent among his fellow Greeks. He would then begin his venture into the Indian subcontinent, where he would invite the chieftains of the former satrapy of Gardana, a region presently straddling eastern Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, which had fractured due to Persian decline. Many readily complied, however, many did not. Thus, in the winter of 327 BC or 326 BC, we are uncertain, Alexander personally led a campaign against the Aspai of the Kunar Valley, the Gurins of the Guris Valley, and the Asokai of the Swut and Bunr valleys. The Apsopsai would fight most fierce, even managing to wound Alexander in the shoulder with a missile, but eventually the Apsopsai would fall. Alexander then faced the Aksonai, who fought against him from the mountain strongholds of Masanga, Ora, and Oranos. All of these mountain strongholds would be captured after short but brutal and bloody sieges, with each receiving the brutal treatment of Thebes and Tyre. Yet Alexander was still not able to push into India proper, as he had to subdue the border kingdoms between the Thalassies and the Hydaspes. Alexander would send envoys to the kingdoms and ask to meet him on the border and submit to his rule. Ophimus, in Indian he is known as Abhimi, the ruler of the Taxali, whose kingdom extended from the Indus to the Hydaspes River, readily complied, and it is noted that he was not only loyal, but also eager to serve. Yet one king did not submit, that being Porus, king of the Pravas, the modern-day Punjab. He would not yield to Alexander, and is rumored to have replied to the messenger, "Tell your king that I will come and meet him on the border, but I will bring my army with me." With this, battle was decided, and in May of 326 BC, Alexander would meet Porus on the banks of the Hydaspes to decide the fate of the Punjab. Yet little did he, or anyone know, that this battle would be the bloodiest and most hard-fought yet, or that it would be the last major battle that he would partake in. In terms of numbers, again we are not sure. Both sides were said to be about equal in numbers, with Alexander possessing about 35,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and about 5,000 Taxilian allies. Though he would actually only use a fourth of this, Porus had at his disposal anywhere from 30 to 50,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, several hundred chariots, and 200 Indian war elephants. Porus had chosen the field well. It was the monsoon season, and the Hydaspes was swollen and moving quickly, meaning that a contest crossing, like the one done at the Granicus, was far more difficult. So, Alexander devised a plan. He placed his camp directly in front of Porus, mirroring his position, opposite the riverbank. Alexander would then send out foraging parties and scouts around the area. Porus would send his men to mirror these movements from his side of the river, yet nothing would happen. Eventually, Porus would believe that Alexander was settling in for the monsoon season to pass, and he stopped sending his men to mirror Alexander's. This was exactly what Alexander wanted, as during the next night, Alexander would take his most elite men, the Silver Shields, other veteran phalangites, Agrianes, Cretans, horse archers, and his companion cavalry, about 11,000 men in total. And using boats and makeshift bridges, he would cross the river 18 miles upstream. The plan was for Craterus, with the main force of the army to stay in camp, keeping up the illusion to trick Porus. A second cavalry force under Mezeus would try and ford the river to act as a distraction, while Alexander, with his 11,000 men, would cross the river and outflank Porus, striking him from behind, catching him in a massive hammer and anvil. Yet as Alexander crossed the river, to his horror, he was not on the opposite bank, but rather a small island in the middle of the river, forcing Alexander to build another bridge to reach the other side of the river. This delay would prove costly, as by the time Alexander had crossed it, it was already morning, and his large vanguard was quickly detected by Porus' scouts. Porus would leave a small infantry force to prevent crossing, while he would send a cavalry and chariot force to harass Alexander, while he moved to meet his army. Upon seeing this mounted force, Alexander would send over his own cavalry to meet them. The rains had turned the ground to mud, and Porus' chariots were all but useless, allowing the Macedonians to win handily, and even slay Porus' son, who was commanding the forces. Yet his sacrifice would not be in vain, as Porus' army had reached Alexander's force. Alexander, now cut off and outnumbered, anywhere from 3 or 5 to 1, had a choice to make, and he chose to fight. His infantry formed at the center, the light infantry a screen in front, his cavalry on both flanks, with his right flank having more than the left. Porus had his cavalry equally distributed on both flanks, with his infantry in the center, and war elephants directly in front. Alexander would send in his horse archers on the right flank, to draw in the Indian cavalry opposing him. From there he would strike at them from both sides with his superior heavy cavalry. Seeing his left in bad shape, Porus would send his left-wing cavalry to assist them. This is what Alexander was waiting for, as seeing this, his left cavalry wing would outflank the entire Indian army, and strike the Indian cavalry of the right wing from the rear, destroying them utterly, sending the rest fleeing back to the army. From there, Porus would order his army forward, confident his elephants would break through the center. Macedonian infantry had been briefed on how to handle these massive beasts, but even with the preparation, the elephants proved devastating, with historical accounts painting a grim picture. With respite to the massive sarissas of the phalanx, the elephants were able to cause grievous damage, for they would kill men with their trunks, lifting them up into the air and slamming them into the ground, spearing them with their tusks, or simply trampling them underfoot. There was no easy way to kill these beasts. One had to either hack at them, cutting at their legs, eventually cutting through both meat and bone, several men dying in the process to render these beasts immovable. Try and kill their riders, and in some cases the beasts would rampage. It was brutal, bloody, it was carnage, in the most truest sense of the word. Eventually, however, the light infantry would cause enough damage that the elephants would have had enough. For in the end, the battle for the center was about who would break first, and the grizzled veterans, hardened by years of brutal fighting, would not yield. Not now. After so long, they would not run. And so it was that the elephants broke and fled first. The massive beasts were sent careening back into their own lines. At the same time, Alexander's cavalry had hit both flanks. Many Indians broke and fled, yet they would run to the spears of Craterus and Mezeus, who had both made the crossing and driven off the Indian defenders. Yet despite all of this, Porus would not flee, and neither would his men, as it is noted that he and his personal soldiers would fight so bravely and so effectively that Alexander would stop the attack and also speak to Porus. Porus would then appear before Alexander covered in wounds. Alexander is said to have asked him how he would like to be treated. Porus would famously answer, "Treat me as a king would treat another king." Porus would then be attended by Alexander's physicians, and he would submit to Alexander's rule. Alexander, for his part, would give him more land, taking from the neighbouring Asabaris, who had promised to aid both sides, and thus was reduced greatly as a price for such behaviour. Alexander would name him satrap of the new Pravus satrapy. In terms of losses, the Macedons suffered about 1,000 dead with an unknown number injured, while Indian losses were about 22,000, give or take. From there, Alexander would continue to subjugate the city of Sagal. After a brutal and bloody storm, Alexander was ready to cross into India proper and take on the Nanda Empire of Magda and further east the Gandhari Empire of Bagal, which were massive empires said to be able to field hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of elephants. Alexander, as always, was undaunted, yet his men, however, had reached the limit. After having a taste of Indian combat via Porus, and hearing rumours of the vast might of Indian rulers before them, Alexander's soldiers would go no further, for they knew that this would be no short campaign, that it would be both long and bloody, and require them to give it their all. The problem was, they had already given it their all. By 326 BC, Alexander's men had fought for over 10 years, over 2 million square miles, and against nearly all the damn known world. His men were beyond tired, and so utterly exhausted. Alexander would try and motivate his men to follow him into India, yet he was met with silence. Yet this was not a hateful silence, but a sorrowful one. His men were still loyal to their king. They just wanted to rest. When Alexander saw this had no change, he would accuse them of abandoning him, and threatened to march into India on his own if need be. It was at this time that Colonus, one of Alexander's best generals, who had commanded the Macedonian left-wing cavalry during the Battle of the Hydaspes, stood and spoke to their king. He explained that the men were not saying that they did not want to fight anymore. They just wanted to rest. It had been over a decade since they had seen their homes, their families. They had lost thousands of their brothers over the years without any respite. Their swords were blunt, their armor cracked, and their spears chipped. All they wanted was to go back to their home, to see their families, to fix their gear, and to prepare for a new fight. And then they would gladly follow their king into Hades, or wherever else they would ask him to go, be it unarmed and naked if need be. The men responded in thunderous applause, not to praise Colonus, but to thank him for saying what they were all feeling. Alexander would dismiss the men in anger and storm off into his tent. He then stayed there for 2 days, hoping the mood of the men to change. Yet when it became clear that it would not, on the 3rd day he would come out of his tent and sacrifice a bull to the gods. Upon inspecting it, he was said to have said that the gods had sent forth an ill omen, meaning they should not venture into India, and thus he told the assembled men that they were going home. Clearly, a rather obvious and, in my opinion, obnoxious way to save face. Yet his men, they did not care. They cheered Alexander and made their preparations to depart, which included raising 12 stone monuments at the border of the Hydaspes, one for each of the Greek gods, so that all would know where the border of the Greek Empire ended. No, the irony. Also, shortly after this, Colonus was said to have died of illness. While some scholars say that Alexander had a hand in his death, I feel it is important to address this. We should not glorify Alexander, but the opposite is also important. Let us not vilify him for the sake of narrative. He is a human with flaws, not a villain in a play. Many died of disease and rather easily, as remember, they were literally the first of their kind to even enter that land. But, that aside, Alexander would then secure the Hydaspes region by subjugating the Oxygracians, Malians, and Cathians, solidifying his hold on the new area, before making his long trek back into the Persian land proper. It would be here, while besieging a Malian citadel, that Alexander would suffer a near-fatal injury when an arrow penetrated his armor and pierced his lung. Yet he would recover from this, and after the area was pacified, Alexander would march his army back to Babylon. A fourth of the army would travel via sea under Admiral Nearchus, while he would lead the rest of the army via land along the Gedrosian desert, and Makran. Here, for the only time, Alexander's logistics train would fail him and cause him to suffer grievous casualties due to attrition. While ancient sources claim he lost 75% of his army, modern historians believe this to be heavily exaggerated. It's likely that he lost more than 5,000 men, but less than 10,000. Still, it was a disaster. Some subscribe to the theory that Alexander did this to punish his men for refusing to fight. As I mentioned above, I believe this to be for the sake of narrative. Again, for the first time, the navy was separated from the army, and Alexander's logistics did rely a lot on his navy. It is more likely that Alexander did this in an effort to outdo Cyrus the Great, a previous Persian empire who he idolized, which would fit his character. As always, he was far more arrogant than he ever was vengeful, but eventually he would reach Susa. His first act was to execute many satraps who had misused and abused their power. Not just satraps, but also rank and file, for he was flooded with reports of both officers in rank, both Persian and Macedonian, abusing the power and the people under them, the two most common acts being tomb raiding and rape. One example, much to Alexander's outrage, was that the tomb of Cyrus the Great had been raided. He was so enraged by this that he ordered the satrapy of the area beheaded. He would then renovate the tomb, giving it all the grandiose to any Persian or Macedonian king. Such was the respect he had for him. Alexander would not stand for all of this, and after the perpetrators were executed, he would handpick their successors. He would then continue his policy of cultural harmonization. It was Alexander's intention to blend Greek and Persian cultures, an effort to foster permanent unity within the realm, and given what would transpire in the future, this fact is tragically ironic. This would cause much discontent among his Greek contingents, so much so that when Alexander, as a show of thanks, paid off the debts of his soldiers and announced that he would send overaged and disabled veterans back to Macedon, approximately 10,000, led by Craterus, who was supposed to swap roles with Antipater, as the latter and Alexander's mother, Olympias, had been in a cold war with one another for a while now. This would solve the issue, as Alexander would have a loyal general whom his mother did not hate serving in Greece, and Alexander would gain a veteran administrator in general to serve in Asia, which he needed. Yet the transfer would not take place before his death, which would lead to terrible consequences afterwards, for the Cold War would become hot. Yet many of his troops mistook this for him trading him in for the Persians, as Alexander had previously commissioned 30,000 troops trained and equipped in the Macedonian fashion as phalangites, and was said to be very happy and impressed by their drill. This would then lead to the mutiny of Opsus. Unable to find ground, he would execute the 13 ringleaders and harshly rebuke them. When this had no effect, he would then accept their wishes, as he began to actually replace them with Persian units, replacing officers and titles. This would lead to his men to beg for forgiveness. He would then meet with his men and would give another impassioned, tear-filled speech to them. They, who were touched by his words, fell to their knees and apologized. Alexander would tearfully accept, and this act would seemingly repair Alexander's relationship with the army, which was strained after the incident at the Hydaspes. Continuing to try and blend Greek and Persian cultures, Alexander held a mass marriage of his senior officers, including his companions, to Persian and other noblewomen at Susa. Though it must be said that not all these marriages were consented to. Several Macedonians and Persians resented the idea, but were coerced into it, and from what sources tell us, we have few examples of those marriages seeming to have lasted anywhere more than a year. But those who did were said to be harmonious and happy. Exactly what Alexander would have wanted. Ironically, or rightfully, depending on your view, one of those, and the only Diadochi, Seleucus, who is widely considered to be the victor of the succession wars, would be one of them. He was said to have loved his wife Apama, a Persian noblewoman. Though something so romantic is obviously disputed, from my research I have no clear reason to doubt their love. Alexander would spend the next 3 years securing his empire and seeing to its administration. And here Alexander would show that he was a competent statesman as well as general. He began laying the groundwork for many reforms and long-spanning changes. And here we see what many seem to misunderstand about Alexander. Many believe that he was short-sighted, a glory hound, and this was indeed part of his personality. But that's it. It was a part, not the whole. As from what we see here in his administrative plans, Alexander thought of not only his future, but the future of his son, and his grandson and his sons after him. Now, of course, we don't know the exact details, as said reforms ended with his death, but it is a testament to his foresight that these plans were only meant to bear fruit years after they had been conceived. Some speculate that he wished to create a new class of nobles, of both Persian and Macedonian descent, that he wished for the army to become standardized and implement the Macedonian content system across the empire, that he wished to blend the Persian satrap system together with the Greek council system, said system being a catch-all term for having groups of men come together and discuss the affairs of the polis, or in this case, the satrapy. Some even further speculate that this was said to be a counterbalance to the sole power of the satrap, and even further, some claim that Alexander wished to create a new race, a Hellenic Iranian race, that would be the new standard of the empire. and so much more. Again, it must be reiterated that all these ideas previously mentioned are purely speculation, but they are grounded speculation. Yet Alexander had not traded his sword for a quill. He also had begun preparing for new campaigns, with his next target supposedly being Arabia, as well as circumnavigating Africa. During this time, Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and possible lover, died of illness or poisoning, and while Hephaestion was said to have taken ill, he was said to have recovered, but after he had drunk some wine, he was said to fall back into illness and eventually pass away. I have tried to avoid this topic as it is unimportant in the grand scheme of things, but some historians speculate that Alexander was bisexual, with Hephaestion being his lover. The basis for this being some letters written during the time, and they claim that they imply as such. As for my take on this matter, I do not care, as it is truly the least important aspect of the man in question. Yet why is it then that we have two camps who would lay their lives down claiming that he was and that he was not? Simply put, narrative, the classic foe of all history. Many historians, to the bane of us all, have a narrative they wish to champion. So they do one simple yet devious things. They present their theory, their speculation, their wishes, and their opinions as fact, by simply not mentioning that it is their opinion. And this is not a new phenomenon, sadly, as classic historians have been severely guilty of this. Hence why it's been so hard for us to find accurate numbers during all of this. But that begs the question, why are we so concerned about a detail which is completely unimportant? Is truly the most poignant argument we have of such an important historical figure really his sexuality? And why is it so hard for us to come to a conclusion? The correct thing to say is that we don't know, and move on. Yet, why is there so much debate over it? Perhaps it's because that there are some things in the modern day we consider homosexual that were anything but in the ancient day, such as men wrestling each other in the nude. Or perhaps we are so obsessed with this one issue that we don't actually care about the figure or his impact, but rather we simply wish to push our own narrative, and we wish to hijack a great man's story to give credence to our own. A story which we perceive to be more important than his. But I shall stop here, for the risk of diving into the cesspool that is politics. But some food for thought. Regardless of the cause, Hephaestion's death had devastated Alexander, as he ordered the preparation of an expensive funeral pyre in Babylon, along with a public decree for mourning, and was said to have not eaten anything for 3 days straight. Such terrible grief might have been part of the reason why Alexander had contracted an illness, or at least that's one possibility. Some claim alcohol poisoning, as Alexander had always indulged in wine, but after the revolt of the Hydaspes, he was said to have regularly thrown massive feasts dedicated to the god Dionysus, the god of wine and celebration, with one account having him dress up as Dionysus during a feast held during a march. This would cause him to enter into bouts of rampant drunkenness. During one of these episodes, he and Clytus the Black would enter into a violent argument, ultimately resulting in Alexander running him through with a javelin, killing him. Clytus' death would haunt Alexander for the rest of his life. Others claim he died as his father had died, another victim of the vicious Macedonian court. It would not be the first time, as during his Sogdian campaign, an attempt was made to assassinate him via poison. Apparently, Philotas, one of Alexander's friends and commander of his companion cavalry, knew of this plot, yet did not inform Alexander. Some say due to jealousness, others say that he did it on the orders of his father, Parmenion. Regardless, the result was the same. Both were silently executed for treason. Another plot to kill Alexander, this time by one of his royal pages, his official historian, Galanthesis of Olynthus, though some claim he was implicated only as an excuse to execute him for falling out of favor, or maybe it was a combination of all three. Whatever the true reason is, we will never know. What we do know, however, is that either on the 10th or the 11th of June, 323 BC, Alexander III, king of Macedon, hegemon of the Hellenic League, pharaoh of Egypt, king of kings of the Persian Empire, Raja of the Indus and Hydaspes rivers, and ruler of all the known world, undefeated in battle, and having created the greatest empire the world had ever seen, died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, in Babylon at the age of 32. Alexander's body was laid in a golden arthropod sarcophagus that was filled with honey, which in turn was placed in a golden casket, where he would be transported back to Macedon for burial, alongside his forefathers. Yet once it entered Syria, it would be stolen by Ptolemy, and would eventually be lost to the world, an enduring mystery that we have yet to solve. The entire empire would mourn the loss of the great king, from Greece to India. All would lament his passing, for as diverse as Alexander's empire was, one thing that unified it was the shed blood of their monarch, and sadly, that would be the only thing that would unite them. Now, shortly after his passing, with no confirmed heir, as his son was yet to be born, his generals would begin carving up his territory under the guise of regents and governors. And while some most definitely meant to keep their loyalty, their colleagues would force their hands, resulting in 4 massive wars. And these wars were so shaped by their participants that they would take their name, as the Wars of the Diadochi would see countless devastation and destruction, along with the murder of Alexander's wife Roxanne and his 13-year-old son and heir, completely erasing Alexander's direct lineage. Yet as always, even in his death, Alexander's myth does not end, as it is claimed that moments before he died, he was said to have raised his hand in the air, and with his final words, he was said to have uttered Kratistos, or to the strongest, implying that he wanted his generals to fight for the right to rule. This is most likely an excuse for some of his generals' later actions, and in my opinion, it most definitely is. But, as always, we don't know. In the end, 3 successors would remain: Antigonid Macedon, Ptolemaic Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, who, having claimed the lion's share of the empire, was the true successor to Alexander, if only in name. And thus did Seleucus I earn the name Nicanor, or Victor. Yet the real victories had been won decades earlier, by a young Macedonian king. Flawed, but undeniably talented, and he would win battle after battle, and somehow conquer the known world. And while it did not last, all acknowledged that his deeds were far above a normal man. For he was not normal. He was the greatest Alexander there ever was, and thus forever after this would he be known as Megus Alexandros, or Alexander the Great. But while Alexander was the one who led the conquest, let's take a look at the men who conquered it. The Macedonian army that would conquer the Persian Empire and beyond would start under Alexander's father, Philip. Philip spent much of his childhood as a hostage in Thebes, while he would study under the great general Epaminondas and bear witness to many of his military reforms. From there, he would come away with 2 main ideas. 1, a standing professional army was mandatory, and 2, long spears were better. Philip would do both, instituting a canton system, in which each village had to supply a certain amount of military men for service. Gear and training would be provided for by the state, and Philip would standardize the gear and introduce the sarissa, a 5 to 6 meter long pike. He would also train and drill his men hard, having them march and perform battle maneuvers in full gear, in all types of weather and in all types of terrain. Combine this with the fact that the training was regular and mandatory, and physical training was encouraged in social settings even after one had served their stint in the army via the means of the gymnasiums, meant that Macedon always had a core of able-bodied and well-trained men ready for service. It would also further bolster Macedon's already good cavalry, making it truly excellent. It would also drastically streamline the baggage train and significantly improve the logistics system, meaning that the Macedonian army moved quicker with more stable access to supplies. Alexander would further build upon these reforms by focusing upon both siege engines and the navy, and further advancing the other branches. One of his first acts was to convey the term Thesatairoi, or foot companions, to all of the army, and not just the elite royal foot guards who previously held the title. The foot guard, in return, would receive the name Hypaspis, or the shield bearer. Let us now take a look at these units. The core of the army was the phalangites. Each phalangite would wear a woolen tunic, known as a chiton. From there, they would then have a breastplate of sorts. This, most commonly, was the linothorax, that being a breastplate made of hardening several layers of leather or in some cases linen or other cloth together and gluing them, forming a rigid hard plate. Despite what you may think, this proved very effective, and was said to be just as good or slightly less better than bronze armor. That being said, bronze and iron breastplates were very much common. In addition, we do have a few records of some later on investing in some sorts of chain armor. Now, this is not necessarily full chain coats, but rather reinforced chain pieces upon the linothorax, which often usually had its middle, as well as much of it, reinforced with either scale or chainmail armor. They would be equipped with 2 clip-on greaves. In addition, they would have a helmet for support. Now, this helmet could take very different varieties, but the most famous was the Phrygian style with accompanying mouthguard. The final piece of equipment for defense would be a peltis shield, which would be held in the arm but also strapped to the neck. They would be equipped for offense with, as I mentioned, the 5 to 6 meter long sarissa with both a devastating end on the front as well as a butt spike in the bottom. For a secondary weapon, they carried a sword, either the hacking design kopis or the leaf-shaped cypos. The phalanx would then be divided into files, a loci of 16 men, which commanded by a decarch, 4 files formed the smallest unit, the semina, 2 semina formed a 128-man locos, led by a locagos. It was here where the locagos received its first specialized units. The Spalangetius, who was a bugler, the Semaphoros, who was a signalman or standard bearer, the Stratocrox, the second to the locagos, who would shout out orders, and then finally the Harparetius, who was essentially a messenger, meant a message from one locagos to another. It was either the loci or the next one, that being the 256-man stagmata, which would then be formed of 2 loci, which would be the main combat unit of the phalanx, depending of course on the size of phalanx and the need of the army. 2 syntagma would form a 512-man pentacarsia, and 2 pentacarsiae would fire a 1,240 kilarchi. 2 such kilarchis would be formed into a phalanx, or a phalanx taxis, of 2,048 men. As we mentioned, at the height there was said to be about 9 to 10,000 phalangites in Alexander's army. From there we have the Arianis. The Arianis were light javelin throwers, and very good at their craft. They were known to be armed with a large overweight shield, or in some cases we have them being armed with a pelter. They carried approximately 5 to 7 javelins with them, and a light sword for defense. They were known to have a metal-style helmet, as well as wearing a chiton. Some of them may have worn padded garments as armor, but we are uncertain of this. We then have the Cretan archers. The Cretan archers were armed with the famous Crete bow, as well as arrows of various varieties. They were said to wear a normal chiton and carry either a short sword, either the corpus or the xephos, or a dagger as a secondary, though their equipment did vary. As for the other light infantry, they were armed in similar fashion. Lighter melee infantry most likely had a metal helmet as well as some type of padded garment with them, and lighter ranged infantry, generally speaking, had nothing at all, instead relying on their speed and their skill to get rid of a problem rather than face it head on. We then have the Hypaspes, or the shield bearers. These were the elite heavy infantry of Macedon, and they were equipped in the standard style of hoplites, though there is some debate against this. Some claim that they were armed simply as phalangites, but given the nature of the phalanx and how these were supposed to be a bit more flexible, I tend to agree with the theory that they are actually hoplite style. They will be armed with the chiton as well, but generally speaking these were given solid iron or bronze breastplates, though it was not uncommon to see reinforced line on thorax among their kind. It did depend on preference. In addition, they were equipped with clip-on greaves, as well as braces, and they were armed with the massive hoplon shield, a large rounded concave shield made together of layered wood and then covered in animal hide. Though we do have some cases of them being lined in iron, but these are far more rarer and are unlikely meant to be battlefield, much more ceremonial. But again, we don't really know. They were armed with the Phrygian style helmet with the face guards. They had a doru, which was a 2.5 to 3 meter spear, about roughly half the size of the sarissa, and they were armed with either a corpus or the xephos. We then have the elite Macedonian cavalry, that being the companions. The companions were organized into ile, or squadrons, of 2,000 to 3,000 men, with the royal ile, Alexander's personal guard, being double strength. They were mounted upon their horses, and generally speaking, when they started off, they didn't wear any heavy armor on the horses, and they only had saddles. But as they began to be introduced more and more to Persian cataphracts, we do have some references of them slowly transitioning into having armor for the horses, which would ultimately lead to the formation of the Seleucid cataphracts under the Seleucid Empire. Though it's not a straight transition, it's more of a byproduct as such. The cavalrymen would be wearing the chiton as well, bronze breastplate, as well as greaves, and be armed with either a xephos or the corpus, who would be equipped with a Macedonian cavalry helm, pictured as such, which allowed for much more vision and better hearing. In addition, he would be armed with a massive lance, approximately 4 to 5 meters long, essentially a cavalry version of the sarissa, known as the Cantarius. Again, there would be about 1,800 at their height. The Thessalian heavy cavalry were similarly equipped as the companions, but their gear was not as good. As for the light cavalry, normally they have little to no equipment, or again they would be armed with either a light padded vest and a metal helmet at most. Though generally speaking that would be more of the javelin cavalry, as the ranged cavalry, such as mounted archers, preferred much more to do their work from horseback. Over the time, Persian cataphracts, Persian heavy infantry, Persian archers and horse archers, as well as Persian troops trained in the Macedonian fashion, in addition to any mercenaries and allied forces, would find their way into the Macedonian army. Yet this practice would die with Alexander, as his successors would exclusively recruit Greek and Macedonians, not just for the military, but also administrative circles. Again, the one exception to this seems to be Seleucus, who was far more acceptable of integration with the Persians. The classic tactic of Alexander's army was the hammer and anvil, where his phalanx would pin the enemy in place and his companion cavalry would outflank the enemy and strike them from the rear, crushing the enemy between the two formations. This would work incredibly well throughout the entirety of Alexander's campaigns, though his generals would find less and less success with it, mainly because they tend to neglect one aspect of the army, whether that be the light troops, the infantry itself, or the cavalry. One of the units I would like to mention are the Argaraspides, or the Silver Shields, the first regiment of the Hypaspes. These men were the most veteran and deadly warriors of the Macedonian army. They were the unit that Alexander consistently relied upon, with him being the one to give them the name the Silver Shields, as he coated their shields in silver sometime during their campaign in India in honor of the regiment, most likely before the incident at Hydaspes. Alexander would be their only master, however, as during the wars of the Diadochi, they would act more like a mercenary unit, fighting for different lords depending on the situation they found themselves in. Despite being in their 60s and sometimes their 70s, their prowess did not decrease, and they remain undefeated, crushing any foe who dared to face them. At the Battle of Gabanin in 316, they settled with Antigonus I Mophalunus, after he managed to take possession of their baggage train, which consisted of their wives, families, and 40 years of plunder. One of their commanders, Tumultuus, negotiated with Antigonus to obtain the safe return of their possessions and family, in exchange for delivering their general Eumenes. The Silver Shields would agree, and Eumenes would be delivered to Antigonus. Antigonus would then send them to the most eastern reaches of his realm, with hopes that they would slowly die off in random engagements, so that they would not influence the succession wars. But the exact opposite would happen, as the vast majority of them would settle in the Macedonian settlements in the east, away from the conflict, finally enjoying their well-earned retirement. And with that, the story of Alexander the Great is known to us. And now that we know his story, and the story of the Lord Solar Macharius, now allow me to ask you this question. Are these men truly the same person? We have learnt of the great conquerors of humanity, one from our past, and one that could be in our future, though hopefully not given all that accompanies it. That conundrum aside, we now know their stories, and thus we know how similar they are. And they are quite similar, which shouldn't be too surprising. Both men were incredibly gifted military geniuses, who were not only able to understand situations, but also adapt to them. Both men led vast conquests of territory against an enemy which had long tormented them. Both were leaders of men who could command entire armies with merely their words. Both men were brave and noble warriors who always thirst to draw blood and to receive it. Both were overly ambitious men who didn't know when to stop. Both were flawed men who would often forget to consider others. Both had a drinking problem. Both of their empires shattered like a broken dream when they died. And both died under mysterious circumstances, with them both being idolized as the greatest conquerors and exemplars of their people. The Lord Solar Macharius is 40k's version of Alexander the Great. That is what he was meant to be, that is what the writers intended, and what exactly they succeeded in. Yet you all knew all of that. Why then would I ask such an obvious question? Well, I wouldn't. And I haven't. For you see, when I say, are these men the same person, I don't mean it in a philosophical sense. No. I mean it in a literal sense. For if the 40k writers wanted Alexander the Great in Warhammer 40k, why not just put him in there? Or rather, just have him become Macharius. For ladies and gentlemen, Alexander the Great was already in 40k. Alright, I'll cut the dramatic flair and the sensual build-up. So, what am I talking about? It, like all things involving humans in 40k, starts with the Emperor. The Emperor would only reveal himself to humanity in the 30th millennium, during the Age of Strife, but he was present through all of humanity's history, and he moved to usher humanity towards their fate. And he did this by slightly intervening in our history, as great figures of men. That's right. Many of the people and myths from our history were the Emperor of mankind. One that we have confirmed is St. George, the knight who would slay the great dragon. Said dragon being a shard of the Void Dragon, which the Emperor then imprisoned under Mars. But that's another long story for another long day. Another figure that he could have been was Alexander the Great. Yet this isn't just me reaching around for something in the dark, as during the 80s and 90s, at the same time that the lore for the Lord Solar Macharius was also written, through several issues of White Dwarf, it was heavily implied that Alexander the Great was indeed the Emperor. So the Emperor is Alexander the Great. But that begs the question, is the Lord Solar Macharius also the Emperor of mankind then? In a way, yes. Macharius was a living saint, or rather he had the powers and abilities of one. In any case, he had the Emperor's blessing, and the Emperor's power. So much power that he was able to banish a greater demon of Tzeentch. The point being, he was connected to the Emperor. As some of you may know, the Emperor's soul, or his psyche, or perhaps both, was shattered into countless pieces, which were scattered across the warp. And a theory about living saints, or the Emperor's blessed, is that a shard of the Emperor is guided through the warp by the Emperor himself and given unto those whom he finds worthy. Said shard would then be the Emperor, and thus, in essence, a piece of the Emperor is reborn into another human being. The Emperor gets reincarnated, which means Alexander the Great also gets reincarnated, meaning that Alexander the Great was reincarnated into the Imperium of Man as the Lord Solar Macharius. Theories are more solid than you thought, but I believe that it's fair, and makes a very good amount of sense, and there's also something to be said about coming full circle. So, the Lord Solar Macharius and Alexander the Great are not only the same person in theory and idea, but also in action and reality. But now, I would ask of you an indulgence, only for a time, as I wish to discuss these men, not in regards to who they are, but rather what they are and what they represent. I will be referring to both Alexander and Macharius when I speak of Alexander purely for convenience sake, as both could be applied to each other, within reason of course. Alexander was an interesting man. Regardless if you refer to him as the Great or the Accursed, you cannot deny that the man was special. He had a way about him that made him irresistible to follow. You would see this young, handsome king giving you a roar of courage as he would charge headlong into death and bid you join him. And there is no man amongst us who would not consider his offer. The man was infectious, relentless, he wouldn't stop, and ultimately, that was his downfall. He was arrogant, foolhardy at times. He went with his instinct, and always took risks. Well, fortune favored the bold. But most of all, Alexander was ambitious, and he was a dreamer. He dreamt of himself reaching heights never seen before, and never even thought possible. But what people tend to forget is that Alexander never forgot about those he was with. And while yes, he didn't want to be completely first among equals, even God amongst equals, he still wanted to be equals, if not completely, at least partly. He pushed so hard to try and integrate the Greek and Persian cultures, who had been at war for decades, who were taught to see each other as lesser and evil, and he saw the possibility of a united empire, one both Persian and Greek, even if it was just purely for convenience rather than any moral high ground. Regardless, in the end, it might have been what costed him his life. Now, I am not an ambitious man. I am a simple man who wants simple things, and I am completely content when I have them. But I am a dreamer. I dream of great and wonderful things, things that seem impossible, things which some would call unobtainable, dreams in which everything goes right. But these thoughts are usually quickly dismissed as for what they are. Dreams. Yet, ever since researching the script, I found myself asking, what if I too were ambitious? Not enough to be like Alexander, but enough to make a difference. For Alexander only accomplished what he did because of his ambition, and that ambition was due to his confidence, or arrogance depending on how you look at it. So what if I had some of that confidence? Well-behaved people seldom make history, but ambitious ones, they either make their history or die trying. If Alexander had been like me, he would have dismissed his dreams and settled for less. He would never have accomplished what he did. Yet, if Alexander had been like me, he would have stopped short, but his empire would have lasted longer, much longer possibly, and that is where it struck me. Alexander was ambition. He pulled people towards destiny, yet he also had stability. He had reason. People who would rein him in and offer him wiser counsel, and put him on the right path. In the wake of Alexander's death, all that was left was ambition. All of his companions were ambitious men, except for one. In every account written about him, Hephaestion has never been described as ambitious. He was simply content in following Alexander, and he often was a voice of reason. He was the reason to Alexander's ambition. How poetic it is then, that after reason died, ambition shortly followed. People always speculate on what if Alexander had lived, but no one asks what if Hephaestion had lived. I'm not saying they would have made the empire live, or that it would have lasted longer, but what if? What if we had Alexander's right-hand man? He would be one of, if not the most powerful Diadochi, and he would be utterly loyal not to himself, but to the wishes of Alexander. I can't speculate much, but I can say that he would have given his life to protect Alexander's wife and child. In the end, when looking at Alexander the Great, people either seem to damn him as an ambitious fool or champion him as a great man of all men. Yet what they fail to see is that Alexander was the main part of a larger machine. Philip laid the groundwork for Alexander. He had able-bodied and competent generals and men who would follow him. He had people like Hephaestion who would check his ambition with their reason. Alexander was a dreamer. He dreamt a dream so big that no one could ignore it or forget it, as his successors would spend decades chasing that dream. Then yet none, not even Seleucus Nicanor, would achieve it. Many argue as to why, but I say it's because they did it for power. Alexander, for all his faults, truly believed in his dream. He believed that it was possible to unify Persia and Greece. He believed that he was indeed the son of a god, and he believed that fortune truly favored the bold. But all fortune eventually ends. When looking at the life of Alexander the Great, people, like in all things, wish to place him in a box of either good or bad. Yet he was neither. He was a man with damnable flaws and aspirational strengths. Ultimately, I believe that Alexander's tale is one of caution. Dream, and dream big. Run with all your strength, and fight with all your might to achieve it. Yet, unlike Alexander, do not leave stability to the last minute. Instead, practice both ambition and reason in equal measure, so that both will grow. For if one fails, so too will the other. Recognize your own faults, and work to overcome them. Do not rely on your friends to be your sole voice of reason, for what will happen if they pass? Alexander III was a great man, but he was a flawed man, and he never addressed those flaws. Due to that, what he built quickly fell apart after his death. Now we can never know what would change, or how great the change would be, but we do know things would change, and they would change for the better, if only briefly. But for now, let us look at the story of a man who, despite all his flaws, achieved greatness. And let us learn from him. Let those with reason gain ambition, let those with ambition gain reason, but let all practice both in equal measure, that you may achieve your dreams, and that your sons after you may also see them. And ultimately, that is what I believe is the greatest lesson we can learn from a truly great man, the greatest Alexander, Megas Alexandros. And in that regard, it is the same lesson that we can learn from the Lord Solar Macharius. And ladies and gentlemen, I can say without a single shred of a doubt that Alexander the Great and the Lord Solar Macharius are truly the same man. Fucking took me 3 hours to fucking record. I am cooked. Alright, hi. New type of video, new style, new format. Let me know if you guys like it. This is how stuff is going to be in the future. I want to do something a bit more serious, but yeah, I'm knackered, so I'm going to save up all the nonsense. Thank you, I love you for watching. Click on all the things. Make sure to do the liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing. Join the memberships. You're gonna access the videos a day early, as well as an awesome benefits and some shoutouts like Mr. Thomas Rosalons and Mr. Ivan_SPW. Thank you guys so much for your love and support. I love you and appreciate you, but remember, this will always be free. If you got an extra $1, just throw your boy, but you don't got to. I will love and appreciate y'all just the same. Yes, I will. Mwah! But ladies and gentlemen, I have been the General Bradley 101. You've been beautiful, awesome, and amazing people. Thank you all so very much for watching, boys and gals. Make sure to stay ambitious out there, boys and gals, but also reasonable. And I will catch y'all next time. Dismiss, Rangers! I hope you guys liked the video. I also hope the comment section is somewhat well behaved. Probably not, but Woohoo!